Book 2, The Experiment. Chapter 1, Another Day, Another Full Moon.
You there, upside downer! I have not forgotten. You have been promised to me. I have not forgotten.
For the 100th time, Denise looked up through the gnarled and twisted branches of the frozen forest. And for the 100th time, she saw the black, leather-winged creature circling high overhead. Half woman, half who knows what, the animal was enough to give anybody the creeps, even if that anybody knew they were only dreaming. It had been exactly 2 months since Denise had traveled to Fayrah and seen the creature. And for 2 months the ugly thing kept coming back and haunting her in her dreams.
Surely you've not forgotten?
Denise swallowed hard. It took a moment to gather her courage before she finally found her voice.
What do you want from me? Leave me alone!
Suddenly the entire forest broke into laughter. And more suddenly still, Denise realized that she wasn't standing in a forest. Instead, she was sitting in her classroom.
All I want from you, young lady, is to tell me the subject of this sentence.
It was Mrs. Barnick, her English teacher. She stood 3 desks ahead of Denise, with anything but a pleased look on her face. Denise stalled, desperately trying to push the dream out of her mind while she searched for the sentence. What sentence? Where was it? What, on the blackboard? In her book? There were more giggles and whispers from those around her. She could feel the tops of her ears start to burn like they always did when she got mad or embarrassed.
Denny.
Mrs. Barnick spoke evenly as she pointed to the sideboard.
It's sentence number 3 from yesterday's assignment. The clown's humor was quite bizarre.
Denise peered at the board.
What is the subject of that sentence? What is bizarre?
Oh, she is.
The crack came from a red-haired kid 2 rows over. Again the room broke into laughter. The kid grinned proudly over his sharp wit, until his eyes met Denise's, until her look made it clear what every other person in Lincoln Elementary already knew. You didn't give Denise Wolfe a rough time without paying for it with either a bloody nose or a black eye or both. Now, it's true, since her return from Fayrah, Denise had made great progress in controlling her temper. But self-control doesn't come overnight, a fact that the red-headed kid would become painfully aware of.
In the future, Denny, I suggest you do your sleeping at home.
Yes, ma'am.
Just then the bell to end the class rang. She gathered her books and crowded toward the door with the rest of the kids, where she received the usual "way to goes" and "nice work" from the ones who liked risking their lives. But it really wasn't her fault. She wasn't the one who'd put English at the end of the day. Who in their right mind would schedule the world's most boring subject for 6th period? No, make that the 2nd most boring subject. She'd almost forgotten about math. But she scores so high on the tests, the counselor had told her mother. If she'd just apply herself, she'd be an A student, the teachers had insisted.
Yeah, well, let them try being me for a day. That would show 'em.
Denise shuffled down the hall toward her locker. Instinctively, she glanced around the hall for the red-haired kid. But he was no fool. Already he was heading for the exit. Already he knew that it would be best for him to stay out of her way, at least for the next couple decades. Denise arrived at her locker and threw open the door. She began loading up with the evening's torture of homework when the thought suddenly struck her. Wait a minute. Tonight's the night. Tonight we use the bloodstone to signal Aristophanes. Tonight I'll finally prove to Joshua that it wasn't just make-believe or mass hysteria or how did he put it, a couple kids' overactive imaginations? With dramatic flair, she dumped the books back into her locker, slammed it shut, and headed for the next building, the middle school's gymnasium. That's where the other kids would be setting up their science projects. And since it involves science, that, of course, is where Josh O'Brien would be.
Hey, Denny!
It was Nathan, Josh's little brother. She slowed down to let him catch up. His limp was just as painful to watch as ever. They'd both hoped it would disappear after their trip to Fayrah, after Denise had seen him without it in the stream's reflection. But no such luck. It was still there, just as obvious as ever. But there were other changes. As with Denise, there were far deeper changes. For starters, Nathan was no longer the most selfish human being on the face of the planet. Oh, he still had his moments. Like Denise, there were still plenty of areas that needed work. But instead of some modern-day Scrooge, well, he was coming off more like your average run-of-the-mill corporate CEO. Not a great improvement, but a start.
Listen, I might be late tonight.
What? Tonight's the full moon. If we don't signal them tonight...
She spotted a group of kids straining to eavesdrop and lowered her voice.
If we don't signal them tonight, we'll have to wait a whole nother month.
I know, but we're having a geography test tomorrow.
So?
So Jerry Boleslavsky's having a lousy time memorizing his state capitals.
So
I promised I'd help.
Nathan.
How'd I know our teacher was going to spring the test on us tomorrow?
Denise took a deep breath. She was not going to get angry. Worse things than this had happened, she was sure of it, although at the moment she couldn't exactly put her finger on one.
Look, we'll get done in time, no sweat. But if I'm not there, you and Josh go on ahead without me.
Nathan?
I'm serious. There'll be other full moons.
Nathan?
Without a word, he turned his back on her and hobbled down the hall.
Nathan! Nathaniel!
There was no answer. Denise let out a sigh. The trip to Fayrah had improved lots of things about Nathan, but it had done little for his stubbornness.
I just don't want you to be too disappointed when nothing happens.
Oh, I won't be.
They rounded the corner and headed up the street toward Grandpa O'Brien's second-hand shop. She couldn't help grinning as she fingered the bloodstone inside her coat pocket. The full moon was already high over their heads. In just a few minutes she'd be exposing the stone to its light. Then she'd see what old Joshy boy had to say about disappointments. For the past couple hours, Josh had been dragging her all around to see the different science projects, explaining what they were about and how they worked. Josh loved science, and for him the hours flew. Denise hated science, and for her the hours crawled. But it wasn't a complete waste. During that time, she had mastered the fine art of faking interest. In fact, she'd become quite an expert at using phrases like, "No kidding," "I see," "Oh, that's neat," and the ever-popular, "uh-huh." Denise didn't mind. Faking interest was a small price to pay for Josh's friendship. A friendship that lasted almost as long as she could remember. It lasted through those painful months after her dad left home. It lasted through her slowly but surely becoming one of the school's oddballs. It even lasted through Josh having to frequently drag her off the wisecracking bullies whose faces she kept pulverizing. Yes, sir, if anybody qualified as a friend, it was Joshua O'Brien. The only problem was he qualified as everybody's friend. Well, he made sure of it. Smart, athletic, funny, he worked very hard at being popular. And if there was anything that drove Denise crazy, it was probably that. Still, his focus on being popular, was a minor annoyance that she'd learned to live with.
Look, I'm not saying something didn't happen to you and Nathan, something emotional or even some sort of natural phenomena. But all this talk about a kingdom and imager and stuff, well, no offense, but it's just a little too far out there for me.
And you don't believe in anything too far out.
I believe in science, in cause and effect. But if you're expecting me to buy some sort of magic performed by some sort of wizard in the sky, sorry, but I'm going to have to pass.
Denise smiled weakly. To be honest, she didn't know much about this wizard-in-the-sky guy either. Oh, sure, everyone in Fayrah had talked about Imager, how he loved them and took a special interest in their lives, but she'd never seen him. In fact, she hadn't even been allowed to enter his city. Even if he did exist, she suspected he'd never have anything to do with her. Not Denise Wolfe, not the Lincoln Elementary all-school oddball. The two of them finally arrived at the second-hand shop. Joshua pushed open the door and the bell gave a little jingle as they stepped inside.
Hey, Gramps, we're here.
A stout old man with thin graying hair shuffled out from behind a row of second-hand toasters.
Good evening to you, Joshua. Oh, and you brought Denny with you, too. What a fine thing.
Hi, Grandpa.
Denise grinned. She always wound up grinning when she talked to the old man. Then, glancing around the shop, she asked,
Did Nathan show up yet?
I haven't seen hide nor hair of him.
Great.
Denise sighed. If he didn't show up soon, she and Joshua would have to go without him. Now that they were safe inside the shop, away from the moonlight, she pulled out the bloodstone. She fiddled with it nervously, dropping it back and forth in her hands. Unfortunately, the bad news had just begun.
Listen, lad, I won't be needing you to close this store tonight like I thought.
No?
They've released Mrs. Thomas from the hospital this afternoon, so I won't be going to visit.
Denise spun to Joshua in concern, but he didn't notice. Instead, all he did was shrug.
Hey, no problem.
But it was a problem, a big problem. How could she signal for the Fayrahnians to come with Grandpa right there in the store? The creatures had barely missed giving the old guy a heart attack the last time they popped in. What would stop it from happening this time around? Terrific, Denise thought. First no Nathan and now no Fayrahnians. What else could go wrong? Unfortunately, she was about to find out. Even though she was inside the shop and was careful to stay away from the windows, Denise had made one little mistake. When she had pulled the bloodstone from her pocket and nervously fiddled with it, she hadn't noticed the reflection on the pots and pans in the display window. She hadn't noticed the glint of moonlight that hit the bottom of one of the pots and reflected in her direction. She hadn't noticed the single glint of moonlight that struck the bloodstone. That is, until the rock in her hands started to glow.
Chapter 2. Just like old times, sorta.
First, Denise tried to stuff the rock back into her coat pocket, but her coat pocket started to glow. Next, she sidled up to one of the drawers behind the counter. When no one was looking, she yanked it open, dumped the rock inside, and slammed it shut. A good idea until the drawer started to glow. Well, things were not looking good. She leaned against the drawer to cover the glow with her body, while at the same time trying to get Joshua's attention. If she could just get him to take Grandpa out of the room for a minute. Well, forget a minute. She'd settle for 5 seconds. But no, he was too busy with some stupid conversation about sports or school or something. Figures, she thought. Let him stand around having a good time while I'm over here trying to save his grandfather from the world's biggest heart attack. She began to whistle. Not a bad plan. Get Joshua's attention and appear to be casual all at the same time. The only problem was Denise didn't know beans about whistling. Never had. So instead of a casual little tune, the only sound that came from her mouth was wet, puckering wheezes. Well, next she tried drumming her fingers on the counter. Maybe that would get his attention. Maybe not. By now, the entire top of the counter had started to glow. So she did what any intelligent girl would do. She hopped up on the counter and tried to hide the light with her body. First she sat this way, then that, but the light just kept on spreading until she had to lie down, completely stretching out across the top of the counter. So there she was, sprawled out on the counter, noisily drumming her fingers while puckering and wheezing a pathetic whistle. And then it happened. It was fainter than normal, but there was no mistaking the clear sounds of Lister Q's cross-dimensionalizer. Well, she'd been expecting it. What she didn't expect was the crashing and banging that followed. The crashing and banging that came from the alley out back.
What on earth?
Prowlers?
We'll see about that.
Grandpa reached under the counter for his nightstick. It was only then that he spotted Denise. By now the glow had completely vanished, but she still lay on the counter.
And would you mind telling me what you're up to?
Oh,
She quickly sat up.
I was, tired. Yeah, I was tired and thought I'd, get some rest.
Josh and Grandpa looked at each other. It was clear neither of them bought the lie, but before they could question her further, there was more outside banging, followed by strange voices, strange arguing voices. Well, with nightstick in hand, Grandpa turned and headed for the back door.
Who's out there? Who's out there, I say? What's going on?
Stop him!
What?
Those are the Fayrahnians, I'm sure of it.
For a moment, Joshua stared at her. She heard Grandpa throw open the back door.
What are you?
His yell froze in mid-sentence.
We've got to stop him.
Denise hopped off the counter and started for the back, but Joshua didn't follow.
Josh?
The boy didn't budge. In fact, he wasn't even moving at all. He just kept staring straight ahead.
Joshua?
Still no response. She crossed back toward him.
Joshua, what's wrong? Josh, can you hear me?
But he didn't move. Not a muscle, not an eyelid. It was as if he had suddenly been frozen. She took a step or two closer and waved her hand in front of his face. Nothing.
It ain't our wish the wrong way to be rubbin', but we ain't used to welcomes with yellin's and clubbin's.
Denise immediately recognized the awful poetry and shouted,
Aristophanes!
She spun around to see the furry, bear-like creature, complete with his walking stick, checkered vest, and straw hat. Behind him loped Listroque, just as tall and purple and cool as always. Without another word, she raced to them and gave them both a hug, but only for a second. She backed up.
Phew! What's that smell?
Aristophanes rolled his eyes over to Listroque. The cool purple dude glanced to the floor, cleared his throat, and finally replied. His speech was as scrambled and backward as ever.
Trouble still a little with cross-dimensionalizer I have I?
So?
So the wrong coordinates he entered again. So instead of this room, the garbage bin we landed in.
Denise burst out laughing. She wasn't sure which was worse, Listroque's sense of direction or Aristophanes' awful rhymes. Well, maybe it was a tie.
But Samson.
She looked around for her favorite of the group, the cute bug with the glowing red tail.
Where's Samson?
The little guy got married to a sweet thing that's dear. And in Fayrah, after weddings, you don't work for a year.
That's great. So Sammy got married. That's terrific.
She tried her best to sound excited, but she didn't quite pull it off. She'd really gotten to love the little guy during their last journey together. The fact that their personalities were exactly the same had a lot to do with it. But now they were saying he was married? Well, that was great. Part of Denise was really happy for him, but there was another part of her that felt just a little bit sad, just a little bit left out. Speaking of left out, she suddenly remembered Joshua and spun back to him.
He going to be all right? I mean, just standing around frozen like that?
He and his grandpa are doing just fine. We've accelerated our clocks past the speed of their time.
Denise didn't quite catch the drift.
Grab their pot.
Listroque pointed to the teapot that sat on the shelf behind her. She looked at him a moment, then reached for it.
Drop now it.
Denise hesitated, not entirely understanding. He nodded for her to go ahead, so, with a shrug, she let the teapot drop. But it didn't drop. It just hung there in midair.
How are you doing that? How are you making it float?
It ain't floating at all. Quite factually, it's falling. We're just speeding so fast that by our time, it's crawling.
No kidding?
Denise grabbed the teapot and let it go again. The results were the same. It just hung there.
So Grandpa and Josh aren't frozen? We're just moving faster than them.
Correct, are you?
But I wanted Josh to come with us. He doesn't believe in any of this stuff, and I wanted him to come see for...
Aristophanes politely interrupted.
We understand the problem. We've been to the Weaver. When it comes to Imager, Josh ain't no believer.
Denise nodded. That was it in a nutshell. She wasn't sure what they meant about the Weaver, but they were right about Josh refusing to believe in Imager.
Worry not to. Coming with us will be he.
Then with a smile he added,
But not all that's.
Denise waited for more.
How loved by Imager are you? Still understand not, do you?
Denise opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. It wouldn't do any good. Whoever this Weaver guy was, he had her figured out as well as he had Joshua. It was true. When it came to Imager, Denise knew there had to be somebody out there running the show. After all that she'd seen and heard on her last trip, she knew that much. But for Imager to actually like her, to take a personal interest in her when he was so awesome and powerful, well, to her it sounded a lot like wishful thinking. A nice idea, but definitely fantasy time. Yet according to Listroque, this was the other reason they had come, to prove to her that it wasn't fantasy.
So pack up your bags. Let's get ready to shove. For Josh, it's the proof. For you, it's the love.
Denise suddenly remembered.
What about Nathan? He wanted to come too.
Later come can he, but now move must we.
Denise hesitated, then gave Lister-Q a nod. After their last adventure together, she knew he could be trusted. Without further ado, he reached for the little remote control box, pressed 4 buttons, and they were off. Suddenly the room filled with blinding light, and then, just as suddenly, there was no room at all, just the light. As with the last trip, Denise felt herself falling. Once again she looked around and saw thousands of bright, multicolored lights, all falling toward a city of much brighter lights below, all falling toward the center, Imager's home. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the brightness, but soon she could make out the glowing forms of Aristophanes and Lister-Q beside her. They were quietly speaking to Joshua. At least she thought it was Joshua. But this Joshua was bigger and more powerful, especially in his shoulders. He had to be, because in each of his thick muscular arms he carried a huge clay pot filled to the brim with water. But not the water of earth. It was the water from Fayrah's stream, the water that was made up of the liquid letters and words.
So you're finally with us.
What do you mean?
Josh spoke as he grinned at Denise. But he really wasn't speaking. It was more like he was thinking.
Speeded up his time past yours, did we? To tell him everything, so frightened not be he.
Denise nodded. She wasn't that thrilled about the idea. It was one thing to zip around somebody else who was frozen, but to be the frozen one was different. Who knew what type of idiot expression she'd had stuck on her face or for how long it had been stuck there? Joshua thought back as if he'd read her mind.
Don't worry. You looked incredible. You still do.
Denise shot him an angry look. It wasn't like Josh to be mean. But when she saw his eyes, she realized he wasn't teasing. Instead, he looked at her with a type of, well, the only word she could think of to describe it was admiration. Flustered and caught off guard, Denise glanced down and immediately saw the reason for Joshua's comment. Once again she was wearing the gorgeous wedding gown, the gown she had seen in the stream, the one made of the intricate lace and tiny glowing pearls. But the pearls weren't the only thing that glowed. She could feel color racing to her cheeks. It was an amazing fact, but she had actually been complimented for her looks. And worse yet, she was actually blushing over it. Not sure what to say or what to do, she avoided the topic altogether. Turning to the Fayranian, she asked,
Did you guys tell him about the center? Did you tell him what he has to do to cross interface?
But neither Lister-Q nor Aristophanes answered. Their eyes were already closed and their heads were tilted back. Already they were beginning to quietly speak words of love and appreciation for Imager.
Yeah, they told me. I'm supposed to think of happy stuff. Maybe sing a song.
No, more than that.
Suddenly memories of the last time she tried to enter the center rushed in. Awful, terrifying memories. Memories of being flung into an empty darkness.
You've got to sing one of your grandpa's songs. That's what Nathan did. The only way he made it through was by singing one of your grandpa's old Irish hymns.
A look of concern crossed Josh's face.
A hymn?
Denise nodded and looked down. The center was quickly approaching. Already she could make out the bright, glowing buildings. Already she could see the thin layer of fog that formed a subtle but impenetrable barrier. Denise felt a wave of panic, and with that panic came the first vibrations. They were very faint but rapidly increased.
I don't know, Denny. I don't remember any hymns.
Sure you do. He used to sing it to you guys at bedtime.
A hymn? I don't think so.
The vibrating grew worse, turning into a shaking which grew more violent by the second.
Come on, Joshua.
There was no mistaking the fear she felt. The scowl on Josh's face grew. Denise cast another look below. They were practically there. Already the shaking was turning into teeth-rattling knocks and bone-jarring bounces. Any moment they would enter the fog where the shaking would increase 1,000 times, where it would turn into violent lurching and lunging. But that would only last a second. Before they knew it, they would both be yanked to a screeching stop, then without warning, hurled in the opposite direction, back past the second-hand store and out into the black void, an empty blackness that was full of nothing but fear and even darker blackness.
Come on, Joshua, think!
Denise's mind cried. She would not experience the terror of that darkness again. She could not.
Think! Think!
The bouncings and bangings grew nightmarish, like a carnival ride out of control, and becoming worse by the second. Then she heard it. It was slow and halting at first, but quickly grew in volume and confidence.
My vision, O Lord, of my heart.
Josh was starting to sing. Sometimes there were pauses, or he would hum as if he couldn't remember the words, but he pressed on.
Not be all else.
That's it, Josh! Keep it up! Keep it up!
Be thou my wisdom, my true word.
The shaking started to decrease, and just in time. Immediately they dropped into the first wispy layers of the center. Denise closed her eyes and forced herself to concentrate on the words.
Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son.
The shaking continued to decrease.
Thou in me dwellest, and I with thee one.
Finally, the shaking stopped altogether. Even with closed eyes, she could tell everything was much brighter now. Much brighter. She was tempted to open her eyes, but she didn't. She knew the sight would fill her with fear, and with that fear the awful shaking would return. Then she felt the firm pressure of something under her feet. They had landed. They had landed at the center. Still, she was afraid to open her eyes, afraid of what she might see. But she knew she'd hate herself forever if she didn't take at least one look, at least one little peek.
Chapter 3. Arrivals.
As Denise and the guys landed at the center, a welcoming party was preparing for their arrival just 5 dimensions away. The vice governor of Bic sat at his banquet table, giving last-minute instructions to Bud, one of the greatest scientists in the realm. Nearly 150 epochs had passed since they quit using words in Bic. Words were so inaccurate when it came to real communication. And in Bic, a kingdom of math and science, accuracy was supreme. So instead of words, everyone simply clicked their tongues. The pauses between clicks, the number of clicks, and the loudness of each click said it all. Of course, it made their poetry a little difficult to appreciate, but they were scientists. What did they care about verse or rhyme? Information had arrived earlier from the Weaver. Bic would finally play host to the 2 precious threads from the Upside-Down Kingdom. One thread, a female, knew of Imager but did not understand his love. The other, a male, refused to believe in Imager at all because it supposedly went against the laws of logic and science. That argument always made Bud chuckle. It was because of Imager's infinite logic and awesome scientific properties that the Kingdom of Bic was created in the first place. Here people could spend their entire life exploring Imager, understanding him through mathematical formulas, marveling over him through scientific investigation. Here people could experience and explain Imager more deeply than any place in the universe. Of course, the boys over in the art kingdoms might not entirely agree, but who cared? Today, they were the ones to help the Upside-Downers. Their kingdom was the one privileged to draw them closer to Imager's heart. For several epochs, Bud had been in charge of building the special laboratory called the Machine. Throughout that time, rumors had spread far and wide regarding who the machine was being built for and when it would be used. Well, today those rumors would finally be put to rest. The machine was designed for the 2 Upside-Downers, particularly for the one who didn't understand Imager's love. And now the vice-governor was giving Bud last-minute instructions on welcoming the Upside-Downers to his kingdom and introducing them to this wonderful new invention. Bud received his orders enthusiastically, then turned and immediately fell over the nearest chair. Now, that wouldn't have been a problem. The folks around the palace were used to Bud being a little, how do they say it, heavy on his feet? But when he jumped up and crashed into the waiter carrying the vice governor's mashed potatoes and chocolate sauce, then spun around, tripped, and landed face first into the vice governor's cream of caramel soup, well, it was bordering on being a problem. The vice governor stared down at Bud and pursed his lips in self-control. Bud stared up from the soup and tried to smile. Then, without a word, he rose, wrung out his mustache, gave a weak sort of salute, and raced out of the palace for all he was worth. It's not that he was embarrassed. Such catastrophes were normal for Bud. Too normal. He may have been one of Bick's greatest scientists, but he was also one of Bick's greatest clods. But none of that mattered now. The upside-downers were about to arrive. They'd only make a brief stop at the center. Since neither of them were rebreathed, they couldn't stay there long. Imager's presence would destroy them. So Bud raced off to make final preparations. There was much to do and little time to do it. Denise's first impression of the center was the blinding white light. Her second was the singing. It was not your average run-of-the-mill school choir stuff. It was swelling, breathtaking, send shivers up your spine type of singing. In fact, it was so beautiful and awe-inspiring that before she knew it, a small lump had formed in her throat. At first, Denise thought that the song came from the various light forms that were strolling past her. But once she grew accustomed to the city's brilliance, she saw that the light creatures weren't the only ones doing the singing. It came from everywhere. The buildings, the streets, the trees, even the blades of grass. A neat trick since none of these things had mouths. Still, somehow, some way, everything seemed to be singing. But that was just one way the song was different. Another was that Denise not only heard it, but she felt it. Inside her. Somehow the notes did more than enter her ears. They seeped into her whole body, resonating in her muscles, her organs, her bones. It was as if all of her insides had joined in the song. Aristophanes grinned at the puzzled look on her face and explained,
All that's of Imager vibrates with his voice. From stars to dirt clods, all sing and rejoice.
Denise nodded, pretending to understand. Then something even stranger happened. Tears began to fill her eyes and flow down her cheeks. And for once in her life, she didn't try to stop them. Suddenly, all she wanted was to sit down on the glowing street and have a good cry. But not a cry of sadness. This was a cry of joy. Imagine Denise Wolfe wanting to sit down on the ground and cry for joy? It's amazing. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she suspected that the emotions had something to do with the song. Because as she felt herself joining in, she also felt something else. For the very first time in her life, Denise began to feel like she belonged. It was a wonderful feeling. After all those years of searching to fit in and be accepted, Denise finally felt that she was, well, the word that kept coming to her mind was home. Denise finally felt that she was home. She glanced over at Josh beside her. He was crying too. Well, good, that meant she wasn't totally out of her mind. Or was she? Because now she noticed something even stranger. She could see through him. Well, not clearly, mind you. It was more like looking at a stained glass window. Josh's form and color were still there, along with most of the details, but now she could actually see some of the light creatures moving behind him. She raised her arm to look at her own hand. It was the same thing. Oh, brother, she thought, now what's going on? She looked to Aristophanes for an answer, but it was Lister Q's turn to explain.
Super reality is the center. Everything else is shadow of it.
Again, she looked at her hand. Well, he was right. Because she wasn't glowing like the rest of the center, and because she seemed to be transparent, she looked like, well, she really did look like a shadow. The thought didn't exactly thrill her, but it didn't upset her either. Not here, not with all this joy and goodness and wonder. She glanced at the passing light creatures. Whenever she looked straight at them, all she saw was a blazing glare of light. But when she looked away and caught them out of the corner of her eye, she could make out some of their details. Details that showed these little creatures really weren't creatures at all. Oh, like the light that was approaching her now. How could it be living? When she glanced off to the side, all she saw was a hammock. That's right, a swinging hammock. But not just any old swinging hammock. It was the very same hammock that hung in her uncle's apple orchard. Well, she was certain of it. It was the very same hammock that she, her mother, and her dad used to romp and play in. The very same one that held all those wonderful memories of their times together, back when they were together. As it passed by, Denise tried to see who was in it, but with little success. Every time she looked directly at the hammock, the whole thing blurred back into a glare of brightness. Then there were the sounds, laughing, giggling, and shouting. She recognized the voices immediately. They were her parents and herself. In fact, for a moment, Denise actually felt like she was back in that hammock, nestled between her parents' loving arms. Oh, the joy was impossible to describe. She looked at Aristophanes. He smiled and answered.
Reality of the center, your logical mind cannot grasp. So your brain sees in symbols to help lighten the task.
It was tough to find her voice with all the emotion racing through her, but at last Denise was able to speak.
You mean that's not my uncle's hammock?
A hammock? Ask Joshua.
No way.
Josh whispered in awe as he watched the same light creature pass.
That's my whole Little League baseball team back in 5th grade, back when we won the All-City Championship.
Right, your whole Little League baseball team.
But when she looked at him, she saw he wasn't joking. In fact, his face was glowing with as much joy as hers. He obviously saw the light creature as one thing, while she saw it as something entirely different. But whatever they saw, it made them feel exactly the same. Wonderful, warm, incredibly happy. She turned back toward the hammock, or Little League team, or whatever it was. Now it was further down the road and was beginning to look like all the other glowing lights. Any detail she'd seen was swallowed up by the overall glare. But it wasn't just the glare of the light creature. It was also the glare from the horizon. For just over the ridge was a light so radiant, so brilliant, that it made all of the other lights dim by comparison. But it was more than just light. There was something different about this light. It had a quality, a type of splendor about it, a type of glory. A glory so intense that Denise caught her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest. She began to breathe faster. Oh, no one had to tell her. Now she knew who the singing was for. Just over the ridge was the source of all the center's light, all the center's beauty, and all the center's glory. Just over the ridge, she would finally see Imager. Without a word, she started up the path toward the top of the ridge. Aristophanes spotted her and cried out,
Denny! No!
But Denise barely heard. She picked up her pace, breaking into a run. Lister Q took off after her.
No, Denny, back come here.
But she wasn't listening. All she could do was stare at the light blazing from behind the ridge. It burned her eyes, making the back of them ache, but she would not stop looking or running. Lister Q caught up to her and started running beside her.
Denny, stop must you.
Why?
She refused to take her eyes off the approaching ridge.
As close to this dare get you.
Why?
She still did not look at him. She still ran for all she was worth.
Rebreathed are not you. Destroy you will his presence.
If Denise had any air in her lungs to spare, she would have broken out laughing.
No way! I feel his love now. I finally see what you and Aristophanes have been saying.
But unapproachable is he. Too pure is he for you.
They passed the other light creatures that were heading toward the ridge, first the hammock, then one creature after another, as Denise continued to press on. Her lungs started to burn, crying out for more air, but that was okay. She was nearly there, nearly at the top of the hill. The music had grown much louder. Denise's joy had increased so that she could barely think. It was all she could do not to laugh or to cry, or both. The song was everywhere, inside her, overpowering her, consuming her. And the light? It was so bright that it was all she could see. It was all she wanted to see. If Lister Q was still shouting at her, she couldn't hear him. If her feet were still touching the path, she couldn't feel them. There was only light. Her thoughts began to dissolve. One concept after another slipped away. She tried remembering her name and couldn't. Her thoughts, her memories, her very identity were vanishing. But it didn't matter, because there was only the light. Stumbling, she glanced down and saw that her body was also disappearing. Vanishing memories, vanishing thoughts, vanishing body. Everything about Denise was disappearing. Every step she took toward the light, less and less of her existed.
Denny, listen to me, you.
But she barely heard, nor did she care. There was only the light. Then it happened, the unthinkable. Denise ran straight through one of the light creatures. She had grown so unreal that she was able to pass through solid objects. It was as if she was only vapor. And with every step she took, she faded more and more. In desperation, Lister Q leapt at her. He hit her at the waist, wrapped his arms around her, and tried to drag her down in a tackle. But he crashed to the ground alone. The body had passed through his arms like smoke.
Denny!
But Denise no longer heard. She no longer cared. Denise no longer existed.
Chapter 4. The Weaver.
9 hours!
Josh paced the white marble floor.
How much longer?
He threw another glance toward the glass and steel doors. They had remained tightly shut ever since their arrival. Ever since an emergency team had raced through them with the last remaining vapors they had recovered of Denise. For the past several hours, Josh had been eyeing those doors, studying the stark black letters that read, "Restricted Area, Entrance Prohibited." And with the passing of each hour, Joshua's suspicions rose that, restricted or not, he was going to have to break through those doors to find his friend. It was just a matter of time, and of getting past the 2 huge elk-like guards who blocked the double doors with their antlers. Aristophanes stood near one end of the crystal windows at the far side of the room. They were in Fayrah now. Lister Q had cross-dimensionalized them over as quickly as possible, and since Josh was an upside-downer, Aristophanes had already given him the water from the stream so he could see and hear right side up. Now the pudgy bear-like creature gazed out onto the lush courtyard where 100 Fayranians quietly waited and prayed. Denise had been their friend. In fact, many of them had been rescued as a result of her last visit. Aristophanes raised his eyes from the crowd to look at the distant Blood Mountains. They glowed and pulsed the way they always did when citizens from the Upside-Down Kingdom were present.
I shouldn't have taken you there.
There was no trace of poetry in his voice. Normally that might have been a relief, except that Aristophanes only forgot his poetry when things looked their worst.
Until you were both rebreathed, I should never have taken you there.
Suddenly the door leading to the courtyard flew open. 2 Fayranians raced in. One looked exactly like Aristophanes, except for the 4 ears and 2 noses. The other looked like a walking seahorse with legs. They held a long, hollow tube between them with something glowing inside it.
More threads from the center!
Immediately the elk guard stepped aside as the sealed doors whisked open. It was now or never. In a flash, Josh made his move.
Joshua!
But it was too late. Josh broke past the guards and ran down the glaring white hallway for all he was worth. The seahorse shouted as Josh raced past him.
Stop him! He must not see her tapestry!
The 2 guards galloped down the hallway after him. The sound of their hooves echoed against the marble walls and floor. Josh glanced over his shoulder. They were quickly gaining on him. No way was he a match for their powerful legs. But he continued to run. He wasn't worried about being hurt. He knew that wasn't the Fayranian way. He was worried about the elks leaping over him and blocking his path with their large antlers. The opening to a giant room lay just ahead. Josh bore down, straining with every muscle. Suddenly the clatter of hooves stopped. The elk creatures had jumped. He glanced up and saw them sailing high over his head. In a moment they'd land in front of him and prevent his rescue. He had no choice. Suddenly he did what any ex-All-City Little League champion would do. He thrust out his feet, leaned back, and slid across the marble floor. It worked perfectly. The Elks landed in front of him but had no time to drop their antlers and block him. He slid right between their legs and out through the opening. Josh leaped to his feet but quickly came to a stop. He was in some sort of huge lecture hall, standing on a balcony that overlooked hundreds of different creatures, hundreds of different Fayrahnians who, because of his disturbance, were all looking right back at him. Well, all but one. In the center of the hall was a single man wearing what looked like a blacksmith's apron. He was old and balding. What hair he did have was gray and flyaway. He was hunched over and concentrating on an old-fashioned loom used for weaving. But the threads were no ordinary threads. They glowed, and not with ordinary light. These threads glowed with the same brilliance and beauty as the light from the center. And the pattern the old man was weaving shimmered and sparkled with such depth and beauty that it actually made Joshua's chest ache.
"Bring him here."
The weaver never looked up, but kept concentrating on the pattern before him.
But, Weaver, he knows the girl. He must not see.
"It is too late. Yes, it is. Bring him here."
The elk guards exchanged anxious looks. Apparently, approaching the weaver as he worked was not something they relished. But they didn't have to worry, because at that exact moment Aristophanes waddled into the room, huffing and puffing a storm.
The error was all mine. To this I confess. I'll take him down to the weaver to clear up the mess.
The guards didn't have to be asked twice. Gratefully they stepped back. Still gasping, Aristophanes came forward and took hold of Joshua's arm. Well, to most it looked like he took hold of it. Actually, it was Josh who was doing the holding, as he did his best to support the exhausted bear. Taking a deep breath for courage, Aristophanes started to lead Josh down the stairs toward the weaver. Lister Q stepped forward to join him. Aristophanes turned to him in a hushed whisper.
What are you doing? Don't be a sap. As the leader, it's me who should be taking the rap.
But Lister Q only smiled.
Cool.
Joshua looked on, impressed. Lister Q was cool and loyal. But right now Josh was more concerned for Denise. She was down there somewhere, and he had to help her, but where could she have... And then he spotted it. Far from the weaver, at the other end of the room. It was on a table underneath intense glaring lights, the faintest outline of a human body.
Denny!
Correct.
But why isn't anybody with her? They're all with the weaver when they should be at the other table trying to save Denny.
Lister Q tried to explain.
Physical body of hers, only at that table is it.
He pointed to the table where Denise's remains lay.
But her character...
He pointed to the weaver and his loom.
Her character over there is...
What are you talking about?
Josh motioned toward the glowing pattern on the weaver's loom.
That's just some stupid design he's making.
Aristophanes patiently explained.
That design is her life. Each fiber and strand is woven together as imager, planned.
Josh stared at him. He knew his mouth was hanging open, but he didn't much care.
You mean that?
He pointed at the design on the loom.
That's her life? That pattern is who she is?
Aristophanes nodded.
Each thread is a moment in her life's master plan to create a character both glorious and grand.
Josh continued to stare at the pattern that was forming. Aristophanes was right. It was glorious. It was grand. No wonder he was so moved when he first saw it. But there was something else. The more Josh stared at the pattern, the more it began to make sense. Somehow the design really was Denise. Not her body, not what she looked like on the outside, but how she was on the inside, her character, her personality. Somehow the pattern that was appearing on the loom was what Denise was like as a person. Then Josh saw something else.
Wait a minute! What's that?
The weaver had picked up a dark, ugly thread and was adding it to the pattern. It was an awful, sinister color, so evil that it sent a chill down Josh's back. Such ugly darkness had no place with such beauty. In fact, it looked like the weaver was about to destroy his wonderful work by adding the repulsive-looking thread.
What are you doing?
By now they had reached the bottom of the steps. They were only a few yards from the loom.
Stop it! You're ruining it!
Everyone tensed as Josh's voice echoed about the room. Everyone but the weaver. For a moment the old man did not answer, but remained hunched over the loom, carefully working in the dark, ominous thread. When he did speak, it was only one sentence, and he never looked up.
This thread will give her strength and depth. Yes, it will.
But Josh barely heard. He couldn't take his eyes off the thread. It was hideous. If this pattern, this tapestry really was Denise's life, that thread would bring her incredible pain, awful heartache. Even now, as the weaver continued to work it into the pattern, it seemed to conflict with and destroy the beauty of all the other threads, ruining the entire design.
Stop it! You're hurting her!
But the weaver kept right on working. Well, Joshua had to do something. He couldn't just stand around and let the old man destroy his friend's life. He pulled his arm from Aristophanes and started for the loom. He'd rip that awful thread out of the weaver's hand if he had to. But the surrounding Fayranians quickly moved to block his path. He tried to push and shove his way through, but there were just too many of them. If he managed to force one aside, 3 more appeared in its place. Desperately, he looked about. There had to be something he could do. Wait a minute. What about Denise's body? The physical one on the brightly lit table across the room. There wasn't much of it there, just a faint outline. And of course it was only the outside of her without her personality, but some of Denise was better than none of her. Lister Q was the first to see the look in his eyes.
Josh, no!
But he was too late. Josh broke across the hall toward the table. The few Fayranians that stood between Josh and the table tried to stop him, but he was too fast and too strong. Those he couldn't sidestep, he shoved out of the way as he sprinted toward the table that held the faint, quivering form of Denise's body. Aristophanes shouted,
You don't understand! You'll cripple her character! You'll ruin her!
For the first time, the weaver glanced up, and for the first time Josh saw a look of concern cross his face. But it lasted only a second. He quickly returned to his task, working faster than ever. Josh continued forward, just another 20 feet and a few more Fayranians. And then what? Well, then he wasn't sure. Maybe he'd scoop up the faint outline of Denise's body and try to escape with it. Anything to get her away from the weaver and his awful dark thread. He glanced across the room and saw the weaver working faster, his nimble fingers moving the dark thread in and out of the strands, working it in as quickly as possible. It had become a race. The weaver desperate to complete his task, Josh desperate to save Denise before he did. A Fayranian reached out and nearly had Josh until he faked a left and expertly spun around to the right. Besides being a base stealer, Josh was a pretty good halfback. Now it was a clear shot to Denise. That is, until the seahorse leaped off the balcony and landed between them. Well, the animal had obviously seen too many superheroes in the movies and figured this was his big break to become one. Unfortunately, he landed on the hard floor, and the only thing that broke was his ankle. He grabbed it, writhing in agony. Josh sidestepped the poor fellow and continued his race toward the table.
5 strands. The weaver has only 5 strands.
Josh understood. The weaver had 5 strands to go, 5 strands to finish weaving in, 5 strands before the dark thread became a permanent part of Denise's tapestry. He looked up and saw the man's fingers fly. In and out, in and out. Josh looked back to Denise. He was practically there, just 2 more steps to go. He threw another glance at the weaver. In and out. Josh reached the table, raised his arms toward her. She was nearly in his grasp.
Joshua, no. Complete first must be she.
But he paid no attention. Another quick glance to the weaver. In and out. And then, just as Josh's hands touched her semi-transparent form, in and out. The crowd broke into cheers. The weaver had finished. The dark thread was woven into place. Suddenly, the quivering, transparent image of Denise took shape in Josh's arms. She had substance. She had weight, just as he scooped her from the table and pulled her into his arms.
Denny!
Joshua.
As he held her, Josh looked back one last time to see the weaver. The old man sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. Removing his spectacles, he grabbed a handkerchief from his coat. It had been close, but the weaver had succeeded. Now he blotted his face with his handkerchief and shook his head. He muttered only one phrase, but Josh heard it clearly.
Upside-downers. When will they ever learn?
Chapter 5. A Guided Tour.
Josh scowled.
Let me get this straight. You mean to tell me that you've woven the pattern of every person that's ever lived?
That's right. Yes, it is. And that ever will.
The scowl deepened as they walked through a series of large, cavernous hallways. On each wall hung hundreds of shimmering tapestries. Each was intricately beautiful, magnificently breathtaking, and each was fashioned from the same glowing threads as Denise's pattern. The whole place was like a giant art museum, but not like the ones that are full of dull, boring masterpieces, the ones they drag you through on school field trips. No way. These were full of life, glowing, shimmering, quivering with beauty life. It had been several hours since Denise was revived. Now she walked between Josh and the weaver as the old man did his best to fill them in on all that had happened. Denise asked,
How could you keep up? I mean, weaving so many people. Where do you find the time?
Eternity is a bit longer than you can imagine. We had a head start on you.
Josh was still having difficulty.
I'm sorry. This is just a little too weird. I don't think I can buy all of it.
The weaver gave another gentle chuckle.
I knew that would be a problem. Yes, I did. When Imager first asked me to weave that thread into you, I knew you'd have a hard time.
What thread?
The logic thread of yours. The one always wanting proof.
Josh and Denise exchanged looks. Whoever this old-timer was, he certainly had Josh figured out.
But that's okay.
The old man smiled as they shuffled out of one hall and into another.
That's part of the plan. Yes, it is. That's why your tapestry is in these most honored halls.
You're kidding!
Josh's voice cracked. He tried again, clearing his throat, attempting to sound more adult.
That is to say, my tapestry, it's here?
Of course!
Well, can I... is it possible to see it?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's out of the question. Yes, it is.
Why?
An upside-downer is never pleased with his pattern. No, he isn't. Until his design is added to Imager's final tapestry, he always tries to change it.
Oh, I wouldn't do that, I promise.
You wouldn't, you say?
Again he attempted to sound more adult.
No, of course not. You can trust me.
Just as I could trust you not to change Denise's tapestry?
You saw my tapestry?
Josh ignored her and answered the weaver.
Well, that was, different.
You saw my tapestry.
How different?
You were putting in that ugly dark thread.
What thread?
Denise was growing more frustrated that nobody was answering her.
But the thread will give her character. Yes, it will. It will give her...
What thread are you guys talking about?
Denise's shout echoed inside the giant room. She hadn't meant to be quite so loud. All she wanted was some attention. Well, she definitely had it now. For a moment, both of them stared at her as if she had lost her mind. She smiled weakly and repeated the question a bit more quietly.
What thread are we, talking about here?
There is a reappearing thread in your life. Yes, there is. It is dark, and it is sinister.
It's really awful.
Denise looked first to the weaver, then to Josh, then back to the weaver.
Why? I mean, if it's so dark and bad, why do I have to have it?
It was the weaver's turn to clear his throat. Apparently, he hadn't meant to get into all the details, but Josh had pulled him in, and there was no way to get out but with the truth.
The thread will give you character and depth. It will make you one of Imager's most valued creations. Yes, it will.
But what is it? What type of darkness is it?
The weaver gave her a careful look, but instead of answering, he slowly came to a stop in front of another glowing and shimmering masterpiece.
Tell me, what do you two think of this tapestry?
It's terrific, just like all the others, but...
Take a closer look. Both of you. Step closer and look at the threads.
The two exchanged glances and obeyed.
Are they all the same? The threads, I mean. Are they all the same colors and brightness?
Of course not. Otherwise the tapestry would be boring. There'd be nothing to it.
The old man smiled at the answer.
I wove you well, Joshua O'Brien.
Then looking back at the tapestry, he continued.
And the darkest thread, do you see it?
Yes, it's right there in the center. It runs all the way to the bottom.
Good. Now, step back and see how that one thread adds to the overall beauty of the piece.
Once again the two obeyed, and as they stood staring at the pattern, Denise could see how that one dark thread woven in and out created a type of strength, a contrast for the rest of the threads. It seemed to give the entire tapestry its depth, its texture, its greatest beauty.
If I would have disobeyed Imager, if I would have refused to add that thread, tell me, what would have happened?
The whole pattern would fall apart.
The tapestry would be nothing without it.
Right again. Yes, you are.
Who is this person? I can't explain it, but the pattern looks kind of familiar. Do we know him?
Denise turned to the weaver. Now that Josh mentioned it, there was something vaguely familiar about it. The weaver broke into a smile. There was no missing the love that he had for his craftsmanship. At last he spoke.
This is your brother, Nathan O'Brien.
Denise gasped. It was true. She could see it now. Somehow the pattern of that tapestry perfectly displayed Nathan's personality. Well, not just the spoiled, selfish Nathan of a few months ago, but also the new, giving Nathan that had started to emerge. It was amazing. The design really did capture Nathan's character. Completely.
And that dark thread?
The dark thread is Nathan's hip, the deformity that has caused him to limp with such pain over the years.
Denise stared at the tapestry, even more amazed.
Look, how all the brighter threads radiate from that darker one. Look how they are highlighted and magnified, how their beauty is intensified. Without that darker thread, the tapestry would have little substance. It would have none of the depth, the extraordinary strength that you see.
Denise nodded. It was true. Nathan's greatest handicap, in the hands of the weaver, had become his greatest strength. It was incredible. The weaver finished with one last thought.
Imager has great plans for all of you. But sometimes the heart is not big enough to hold such plans. Sometimes it must be enlarged through hardship.
The silence lasted several moments. Finally, Josh turned back to the weaver.
But what about Denny's question? You never answered it. What about her thread?
The weaver looked curiously at Josh.
I'd forgotten your persistence. Perhaps I wove you too well.
Josh continued to wait for his answer.
Denny first met that thread in Keegarp. She saw it circling high above her in the frozen forest.
Denise could feel the hair on her arms begin to rise.
Since then, she has also seen it in her dreams. In fact, the last time you saw it was this afternoon, when you were daydreaming in your 6th period English class.
The witch! That thing flying around with those awful black wings?
She's no witch, Denise. No, she isn't. She is the illusionist, a queen. That is, until Nathan destroyed her kingdom. In any case, she and the evil Bobak have made a pact, and you have been promised to her.
Promised to her?
The weaver nodded gravely.
What are you talking about?
Denise could feel the tops of her ears growing hot with anger.
Nobody can promise me. What do I look like, a baseball card? People can't trade me around without my permission.
That's right. Doesn't she have some say in the matter?
Of course she does. Every decision you make is of your own free will. These threads are only the final outcome. What Imager knows you will eventually choose.
And he knows I'm going to let myself be given to some ugly bat-winged queen?
No. He knows that your struggle against her will be fierce.
So will I win?
The weaver hesitated. Finally, he shook his head.
I cannot answer that. No, I can't. The decision will be yours.
But you know what I'll decide. You just said so.
Please.
The weaver motioned toward the doorway at the end of the hall.
They're waiting.
Who?
Your friends, Listro Q and Aristophanes.
But you haven't answered my question.
I have said too much already.
But...
He raised his hand for silence. It was a gentle movement, but one that made it clear the topic was closed. Starting toward the doorway, he changed the subject altogether.
Your purpose for this journey, has it been fulfilled?
What purpose?
For Joshua.
Oh, you mean proving Imager to him?
The weaver nodded. She looked at Josh. Her friend stared hard at the marble floor. She could tell that he wanted to be polite, and of course be liked, but she could also tell that he wanted to be honest. Finally, he spoke.
Everything about this place seems real. I'll give you that. But it's so different from what everybody else experiences as reality. For all I know, this could be just some sort of dream I'm having.
Denise let out a sigh of frustration and looked at the weaver. But the old man was nodding in quiet understanding. Then he turned to Denise.
And you still do not believe Imager's compassion?
For a moment, the question caught Denise off guard. Then she remembered that was the other reason they'd come. She knew her answer was no better than Josh, so she said nothing. Instead, she stared at the ground, hoping the question would somehow go away. But the weaver continued to wait. Finally, she spoke.
How can I? How can I believe in his love when all he does if you try to get close to him is hurt and destroy you?
Try as she might, she couldn't keep from looking back up at the weaver. The old man nodded, his eyes growing moist around the corners.
Then come. We must not be late.
With that, he turned and resumed shuffling toward the door. Denise and Josh glanced at each other and then followed. It appeared that their adventure wasn't quite over.
Chapter 6. The Machine.
Bud continued testing the microphone. He blew into it and stepped a little closer. Suddenly the speaker squealed with feedback. The guests surrounding the outdoor stage cringed in pain. After agonizing seconds, the noise finally stopped and the folks resumed their smiles and chit-chat. After all, that was Bud up there on stage, and such things were to be expected. Bud had been told that the Upside-Downers had just left Fayrah and were heading for Bick. They'd had a couple minor detours, but now they were on their way. Any second he would have the honor of welcoming them. Denise's machine had been tested and retested for the 1,000th time. It worked perfectly. Now it waited in the gigantic building behind them for her arrival. And across the river on the other side of Bick, Olga, the kingdom's computer, was humming with life, waiting for Josh. Everything was set. Now all he had to do was greet them and escort them safely to their destinations. A simple task, even for Bud. Well, at least that's what he hoped.
Psst! Psst!
Bud looked backstage and saw the most beautiful creature he had ever laid eyes on. Scientifically, she was perfect. Every part of her was a perfect mathematical ratio to another, from the length of her arms to the diameter of her kneecaps to the width of her toenails. The lady wasn't necessarily pretty, but to a mathematician she was more breathtaking than any unified theory equation.
Most important and excellent of all scientists.
Even her voice vibrated in perfect mathematical frequencies.
Please, if you would be so kind as to tell me where I might find the machine, the one you've prepared for the female upside-downer, I have a gift for her.
Bud stuttered as he approached her. The woman's perfection was definitely fogging his mind. She frowned slightly, not understanding the clicks. Realizing she wasn't from Bick, he nervously fumbled for the translator attached to his belt. He turned it on and repeated himself. It translated his clicks perfectly. Almost perfectly. There seemed to be a slight short in the circuits, which made it occasionally repeat a word or two. Then there was the problem of Bud's stuttering.
I'm sorry, but that's a secret. We have word that the illusionist has stolen into our kingdom and he is trying to destroy us.
The who?
Some sort of ugly queen who can transform her looks into any creature she wants.
But what of my gift?
The lady spoke, managing to smile, flirt, and pout all at the same time. Bud was mesmerized. Her perfection had captured his heart.
Surely the most important scientist in the kingdom could figure out something.
She batted her perfectly proportioned eyelids, each with the perfect number of eyelashes.
Don't worry.
Bud suddenly sounded very gallant.
I'll see to it that she gets it personally.
Oh, thank you, sir.
The lady smiled sweetly as she reached out to touch his arm.
You're as kind a man as you are important.
That cinched it. Bud was in love. No doubt about it. He gave a polite little bow as he took the gift into his hands. Then, excusing himself, after all he was an important scientist who had important science-type things to do, he headed back to the microphone. It was then he spotted it. A tiny hole in the bottom corner of the wrapped gift. He turned back to the lady, but she was already gone. That's odd, he thought. Where could she be? He glanced about, but she was nowhere to be found. Oh, well, he figured, waving off a pesky fly that had suddenly started buzzing the gift. She's sure to be in the audience, admiring my importance. I'll see her then. Maybe give her a little smile to make her day. With a confident grin, Bud turned toward the microphone. Again he noticed the fly. It had landed on the gift and was crawling for the tiny hole. He was about to shoo it away when suddenly... Listroque, Aristophanes, and the two upside-downers named Denise and Joshua made their grand and long-awaited entrance into Bick. Now, it would have been a bit more grand if Listroque had not missed the coordinates. Instead of landing on the stage, they landed in a nearby oak tree. Or even that wouldn't have been so bad if they had landed right side up. But there they were, all four of them, hanging upside down in a giant oak, trying their best to look like proper and distinguished visitors.
Nice work.
Aristophanes muttered between clenched teeth as he pretended to smile for the crowd.
Cool.
Listroque answered as he pretended to look cool for the crowd. Denise, on the other hand, didn't appear interested in pretending anything for the crowd.
Listroque? Listroque?
But before Listroque had a chance to defend himself, Bud had begun his speech. He glanced up from the speech in his hands and smiled, but no one was smiling back. In fact, everyone looked pretty confused, as if they didn't understand a word he was saying. What was wrong? Finally, he glanced down at the translator attached to his belt. Of course, it was shorting out again. Only worse, now it wasn't just repeating itself, it was also translating backwards. He gave it a good thwack with his hand. Oh, that did the trick. The backwards problem immediately cleared up. Bud grinned, pleased that all those years in electronics school had finally paid off. He started again.
Greetings, most beloved upside-downers. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you to the kingdom of Bic, the kingdom of math and science.
The audience clapped and clicked enthusiastically, in perfect mathematical unison, of course. And so it continued, as Bud introduced the governor, the vice-governor, the mayor, the superintendent of schools, the assistant superintendent of schools, and on, each and every one of them excited to meet the two upside-downers, and each and every one of them boring Denise and Joshua to death. Bud could see the weariness fill their faces, and he tried his best to hurry through the ceremony. Finally, just a mere 4 hours, 23 minutes, and 8 seconds later, the last speech was made and the last hand shaken. The official welcoming was over. Now at last he could take them to his beloved machine.
This thing is huge!
They arrived at the large 6-story building. There were no doors, no windows, just walls of smooth, shiny metal.
How do we get in?
Bud smiled and produced a skeleton key. He placed it into a nearly invisible lock and gave it a turn. 2 giant doors suddenly appeared in the wall, humming to life as they automatically swung open.
Nice.
Denise threw a look over at Josh. His mouth was dropping open, but not because of the doors, because of what was inside. Before them stretched the largest laboratory Denise had ever seen. Besides the obligatory bubbling beakers and smoking test tubes, there were thousands of electronic thingamajigs and doohickeys that glowed and flashed everywhere she looked. Some towered several stories over their heads, others stretched hundreds of yards into the distance. But no matter how tall they rose or how far they stretched, and no matter how many different colored lights flashed on how many different panels, they all surrounded and focused upon one thing. It lay ahead of them in the center of the building. As they approached it, it reminded Denise of a large round table. It appeared to have no legs or support of any kind. Instead, it simply floated about waist-high. But the closer they got, the more they saw that it was definitely no table. It was more like a round, floating platform. It consisted of 2 layers. The bottom layer appeared to be compacted sand and was about a foot deep. The second layer was a little thinner. It was clear liquid, but a liquid that glowed, almost as brightly as the center. All around the platform's side, some sort of energy field buzzed and hummed. And high above it hovered a giant circular TV screen with a single microphone hanging down. As they arrived, Denise asked in a hushed tone,
What is it?
The experiment.
Bud was grinning from ear to ear, obviously overflowing with pride.
For what?
For you.
Denise turned to him in surprise.
What?
The only way to clearly understand Imager's compassion is to clearly understand his heart.
Yeah, so?
So, with this experiment, you will become a creator. You will gain a creator's heart.
Denise looked at him as if he had lost his mind. Aristophanes smiled and tried to explain.
What better way Imagers love to understand than create your own life to hold in your hand?
Denise still didn't catch on.
What are you guys talking about?
Denny, I think I understand. These guys have set it all up so you can create a life form. Is that right?
Correct.
And by doing this, they hope you'll experience the same feelings that this Imager supposedly has toward his creation.
Correct again.
You're not serious.
Oh, yes, very serious.
But I don't know beans about science. I can't create life.
Don't feel bad. Nobody else has much luck in that department either.
Then how...
Imager. His breath has already been programmed into the machine.
What machine?
Why, this whole laboratory. We've spent the last 3.5 epochs building it for you.
Denise stared amazed.
For me? You built all this for me?
Bud nodded.
At Imogen's request.
But how do I mean, where?
Oh, don't worry. Your only concern is this platform in front of you, and this TV screen and microphone above you.
But I still don't...
All you have to do is speak into the microphone. No matter what you say, great or small, the machine will translate your words into action. The machine will create everything you say within that liquid light, and you will see what you create on the screen above you.
This is crazy.
No, Imager's love is this.
She turned to him.
You knew about this?
Lister Q nodded with a gentle smile.
From our meeting, the very first.
If you need any help, just tell the machine and we'll immediately return.
Bud turned and prepared to leave.
Wait a minute. You're not leaving me.
Yes. It's important that you do this on your own. No one must interfere with what you do. And more importantly, no one must interfere with what you feel.
But I'm sticking around, right?
Sorry.
But I'm the one interested in science. I'm the one you were going to give a rational explanation for what...
This isn't about the mind, Josh. This is about the heart.
Yeah, but...
Your studies of logic are with Olga.
Who?
Our computer, the best in the kingdom.
Josh frowned. It was clear he didn't think a question and answer session with some computer rated with creating your very own life form. Noticing his disappointment, Lister Q spoke.
Worry not do, for your best will be Olga.
Bud turned back to Denise.
Call us whenever you want to quit. Any time, day or night.
Day or night? It's going to last that long?
Bud smiled.
That's up to you.
Denise looked at the hovering platform with its liquid light floating on top of the sand, then up to the machine surrounding her on all sides. This was insane. And yet, if it really was designed for her, and if it really was safe, and she really could quit any time she wanted, on the other hand, all she had was their word. But on the other hand, Josh would kill for this opportunity, so why was she dragging her feet? On the other hand, no, there were too many hands already. It was time for a decision. She turned to Aristophanes, who gave the slightest nod, assuring her everything was okay.
Don't be a-worrying. There's nothing to fear. To the heart of his feelings, this will help you draw near.
Finally, she turned to Josh. Good old Josh. He'd tell her if it was safe or not. He flashed her that world-famous grin of his. She could tell he was still envious, but that he was trying to be grown up about it.
Well, kiddo, I'm guessing this makes you about the luckiest person I've ever met.
She tried to smile back. This was obviously a new definition of lucky. She wanted to tell him how terrified she was of the whole idea, especially the part of being left alone, but the excitement in his eyes made her feel like some stupid little kid afraid of the dark.
No one's ever had a chance like this, and I doubt no one ever will again.
Denise knew his words were meant to encourage her, that she should be grateful for such an honor, and maybe she should. After all, Josh was right. No one had ever had a chance like this, and it was true no one probably ever would again. So how could she refuse? And if she did, how could she ever look at herself in the mirror again? Or look at Josh? Finally, she had her answer. Not because it was what she wanted, but because it was what she knew she should want. She turned back to Bud and in her best I-can-handle-anything tone simply said,
So, when do I start?
Bud grinned.
Right away.
Atta girl! It's gonna be great!
Aristophanes slapped her on the back.
Oh, here, I'd almost forgotten.
Bud reached out and handed Denise the gift he had been carrying under his arm.
It came from a most extraordinary lady who wanted to make sure you got it.
Denise took the present but paid little attention. At the moment, she had a few other things on her mind. After more good lucks and a few hugs, the group finally turned and started for the door. Denise followed them. It wasn't until they were about to step outside that she was again overwhelmed with panic.
Joshua!
He stopped and turned to her.
What's up?
She swallowed hard and shook her head. She would be strong. Even if it killed her, she wouldn't admit being afraid, especially to Josh. He flashed her another reassuring grin.
Have fun, kiddo. What I wouldn't give to be in your shoes.
Denise smiled back, desperately wishing he was. He turned and joined the others at the door. Everyone waved and gave a few more encouragements. Denise nodded and waved back. Bud turned and immediately ran into the side of the door.
Ouch, 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 ouch.
He grabbed his foot while doing a little jig.
Ow, 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 oh. I hate it when that happens.
Denise smiled in spite of herself. After a couple more hops and a few more ouches, Bud pressed a button inside the building. The doors hummed as they started to close. He stepped outside with the others and gave a final wave just before they sealed shut with a foreboding sound. The sound echoed back and forth inside the machine. Denise stood for a long moment, then slowly turned to face the experiment. She had never admitted being afraid of anything before, and she wasn't about to start now. So, after taking a deep breath, she started toward the platform of liquid light, all alone in the giant building. Well, almost all alone.
Chapter 7. The Experiment Begins.
Denise stood beside the platform of liquid light, more than a little puzzled. Creating your own life forms was a lot harder than she imagined. Actually, creating them wasn't so hard. All she had to do was think something up, say it, and the machine did the rest. But thinking it up, that was the brain-bruising part. At first she tried the obvious choices. In front of her was a world of liquid, so she raised her head toward the microphone and called out, "Machine, give me fish." There was a surge of energy, some flashes and crackles, and she got fish. Billions of them. And from what she could see on the screen above her, there were thousands of different varieties, which was nice, for a while. But let's face it, they were just fish. It's not like she could have some great personal relationship with them. Next, she tried animals. You name it, she created it. Lions, hippos, giraffes, aardvarks, though she had no great urge to create the smaller, creepy, crawly varieties. Again, this was nice, but like any great zoo, you can only stand around gawking at the critters so long before you want a little interaction. And since she couldn't get down in the liquid light and play with them, they really didn't hold her interest that long. Then at last she had it. People. Like herself. Of course, if she could create people like herself, then she'd have somebody to talk with, to relate to, and be friends with. Machine, she called, "Create a me." The machine hummed a little louder. The outside energy field sparked a little brighter, until Denise saw an exact duplicate of herself on the screen. Only, well, not to complain, but it was too exact. Every time Denise moved, it moved. Every time Denise had a thought, it had the same thought. "Well, this is no fun," Denise muttered. "Well, this is no fun," the copy of Denise agreed. "What can we do different?" Denise asked. "What can we do different?" the copy repeated. "Don't you have any ideas?" Denise asked. "Don't you?" the copy repeated. Now, in many ways it was worse than the fish or animals. How could she be friends with her own reflection? It was like having a computer or a robot who, although it appeared human, thought and felt exactly like she thought and felt. If she said, "I love you," the reply from her other self would be, "I love you." If she said, "You're cool," she knew she'd get the same response. It was more like talking into a mirror or a tape recorder than having a real friend. There had to be another solution. And then she had it. "Of course, why didn't I think of it before?" "Of course, why didn't I?" came the reply. Ignoring herself, Denise raised her head to the microphone and ordered, "Machine, make a me that's me, but not me." Once again the machine hummed and sparked and flashed. Denise leaned over the platform, waiting breathlessly. She looked up at the screen in anticipation. And then, at last, her greatest and best creation of all formed inside the liquid light. Nearly 12 hours had passed before the illusionist woke up, stretched her 6 hairy legs, and quietly crept out of the hole in the corner of the gift box. True, the nap might have been a bit longer than necessary, but even the most hideous creature in 23 dimensions needed her beauty rest. Besides, she figured, destroying Denise would be easy. Since they were all alone together inside the machine, it would be a piece of cake, which, now that she was in the form of a fly, sounded pretty appealing, especially the frosting part. It wasn't that the illusionist hated Denise. It was that Imager loved her. And since the illusionist hated Imager, and since the best way to hurt someone you hate is to destroy someone they love, well, the illusionist really didn't have any choice in the matter. She had to destroy Denise. But instead of going immediately for the kill, the illusionist decided to remain disguised as a fly just a little bit longer. That way she could buzz the machine a few times to check it out and see what the big deal was. Even in her part of the universe, the illusionist had heard plenty about this newfangled invention that was being built and how Imager hoped to instruct an upside-downer through it. Once she was airborne and looking down upon Denise and the glowing platform, the illusionist grew sick to her stomach. She was not prepared to see such innocence and goodness, such sweetness and kindness. It was absolutely disgusting, thoroughly nauseating. But that was okay, because it would soon come to an end. Very, very soon, it would all come to an end. After Denise created her latest and best creation, she decided to make 2 of them. After all, the only thing better than playing with one person was to play with 2. She suspected she would create more than that in the future, but right now 2 was enough. 2 little life forms in the liquid light, splashing, playing, and joking with each other and with her. And what did she call them? Gus and Gertrude. Physically, they looked exactly like Denise, well, except for the extra set of arms. Denise always thought that human types were a little short-changed in that department, and she wanted her creations to have every advantage.
This way you can brush your teeth and comb your hair at the same time.
Now, of course they couldn't see Denise. She was too big. In fact, she was so big that they just figured she was everywhere. And in a sense, they were right. But even though they couldn't see her, they could hear her. That was one of the orders Denise had given the machine, and it was one of her best. Now the 3 of them could talk and joke and laugh for as long as they wanted. Gus was the funniest, all huffy and puffy and pretending to have all the answers when most of the time he didn't have a clue. How could he? He was only a few hours old. But that didn't stop him from trying. Gertie, she made it clear from the start that she hated the name Gertrude, was also a crack-up. The little gal could get so excited over the simplest of things.
Look, everybody, I have a toe, and I can wiggle it.
And when she wasn't getting excited about having toes or fingers or a belly button, she was constantly bombarding Denise with 1,000 whys and what-ifs and how-comes. They were incredibly cute, reminding Denise of a couple puppies, the way they romped and climbed and played over each other. Better yet, they reminded her of babysitting the Jefferson twins, when they were on their best behavior and when they didn't need their diapers changed. But it was more than just their cuteness and playfulness. There was something else. Denise couldn't put her finger on it, but she'd never felt anything quite like it before. As she continued to watch them, her chest began to ache. But it wasn't a bad ache. It was an ache of pleasure. In fact, sometimes there was so much pleasure that she could hardly breathe. And the more she hovered over her creations, watching and encouraging them in their new adventure called life, the more wonderful the ache grew. Whatever this feeling was, it was safe to say that Denise was definitely becoming attached to these little folks. And they were becoming attached to her. In fact, Gertie put it best when Denise had to leave to take a bathroom break. She was gone only a few minutes, but when she returned, Gertie had her arms folded, all four of them, and began to scold Denise for being gone so long. In her cute little high-pitched voice, she complained,
"It was awful. It was like a part of me was missing. Don't you ever do that again."
Okay. I promise I won't ever do that again.
But even as she joked with her, Denise knew Gertie was right. She was a part of them, and they were a part of her. And why not? After all, didn't they come from Denise's own personality and imagination? Gus with his know-it-all, I-can-tackle-the-world mentality, and cute little Gertie with all of those questions and that big sensitive heart of hers? Both were definitely a part of Denise, and she was definitely a part of them. And then it happened. Gus shouted,
"Hey, guys, watch this!"
He was showing off by swimming little figure eights in the liquid light. Denise looked down at the ripples on the platform. As he swam faster, the figure eights grew bigger and the waves grew taller. It was pretty impressive, even to Denise. Gertie had floated to the surface to get a better view, and as Gus kept making bigger waves, she kept bobbing up and down, higher and lower. Soon Denise and Gertie were laughing so hard that tears streamed down their cheeks. Oh, but not Gus. He was really getting into it.
Okay, Gus. That's enough now.
But Gus didn't hear.
Okay, Gus.
By now he was much closer to the edge. Too close. And still he wasn't paying attention.
Gus! Gus!
No answer. Denise fought back the rising panic inside her. Any second he could swim out too far. Any second he could accidentally swim over the edge and fall to his death. She shouted,
"Gus!"
Gertie joined in.
"Gus! Gus!"
But there was still no response. Denise's panic turned to cold fear as Gus started the next figure eight, his biggest one yet, the one taking him straight toward the edge. What else could she do? How could she stop him?
Gus, listen to me! Gus!
But Gus didn't hear. Suddenly a thought came to Denise. As a last-ditch effort, she quickly turned to the microphone and shouted,
"Machine, create a wall."
The machine hummed, and immediately a wall sprang up around the edge of the platform, and just in time. It had barely formed before Gus hit it, head-on. Well, it was close, but Denise had managed to save Gus just before he'd have fallen over the edge to his death. Yet, instead of showing his appreciation, Gus glared up to the sky, rubbing his head, and shouted,
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
You were swimming off the edge. I had to stop you with this wall.
What do you mean? What's an edge?
It's, an ending.
An ending?
Yeah, it's,
But try as she might, Denise couldn't find a word he'd understand.
It's something that would kill you.
Kill?
You would stop living and thinking. You'd stop existing.
Go on!
No, I'm serious.
Gus was still angry and still rubbing his head.
So why didn't you tell me? This wall thing of yours packs a pretty big wallop.
She tried to tell you. She shouted at you over and over again.
I didn't hear a thing, just the roar.
The roar?
Yeah, a roar that kept getting louder and louder.
Denise threw a glance to the edge of the platform.
Oh, that's the energy field all around the platform. I think it holds it together. I guess it just drowned me out.
What do you mean energy field?
Yeah, and what's a platform? And what do you mean drowned? And what is it?
Never mind.
Denise laughed, relieved that they were back to asking questions.
Never mind. Let's just say it's a good idea not to get so close to the edge next time.
You ain't just a whistling Dixie. That wall of yours is no treat. And this kill stuff doesn't sound so hot either. Thanks for the warning.
No problem.
But Denise wouldn't have been smiling if she had known what the illusionist was thinking. By circling high overhead, the creature had seen everything. Everything from the sickening friendship and love between Denise and the creatures to Gus's near destruction by swimming off the edge. And as she watched, a plan started to form. It was one thing to simply destroy Denise. But it was quite another to make her writhe and suffer in agony first. The illusionist broke into a grin. Writhing and suffering, two of her favorite words. Without a moment's hesitation, the illusionist folded her wings back and dove straight for the platform. Then, just before she splashed into the liquid light, she transformed herself into the shape of Gus and Gertie, complete with the four arms. Across the river, on the other side of Bick, Josh stood in front of another type of machine, Olga. She was no taller than the boy and no thicker than, say, your average run-of-the-mill breakfast waffle, complete, of course, with all those little square holes. Like a giant fence, Olga snaked in and around the entire kingdom. She circled houses and buildings, she passed under overpasses and over underpasses, she cut through farmers' fields, and she crossed over streams. Around and around, back and forth, she wound as far as the eye could see.
What is it?
Well, she's one of the most powerful computers in our dimension. We use her to explore and better understand Imager.
Josh took a deep breath. He always worked hard at being liked by people. Denise would say too hard, but all this talk about Imager was really starting to get to him.
Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but there's just no way you can scientifically prove there's some sort of supreme being out there, someone who knows all and sees all.
Bud started to speak, but Josh wasn't finished.
Well, I'm not saying there isn't something. I definitely experience things at the center, but like I told the Weaver, to try and prove it scientifically, I'm sorry, it's just not possible.
Bud traded smiles with Aristophanes and Listerque. Then he reached over and pressed a single button on the computer. Immediately, a thin sheet of water shot from Olga and floated before them. It was about 3 feet long and a foot wide. Josh was impressed.
It's only a projected image. See?
He ran his hands through it.
Just like a movie.
Josh reached out and touched the water. It was true, there was nothing there. It was just a picture of water floating in midair.
Tell me, what do you know about geometry?
A little. We haven't had it at school yet or anything, but I've done some reading.
Good. In the Upside-Down Kingdom, how many dimensions do you live in?
3. In our world, we have 3 dimensions. Everything has length, that's 1 dimension, and width, that's 2 dimensions, and height, that's the 3rd. Everything from a penny to a skyscraper has 3 dimensions.
Very good, but what if there were more than 3 dimensions?
Some scientists think time is a 4th dimension.
Bud couldn't help smiling.
Interesting theory. But could 5, 6, or 7 dimensions also exist? Is that possible?
Mathematically? Sure. But we could never see them. They'd be past our understanding.
Precisely.
Hold it. Wait a minute. Are you saying this Imager guy lives in a dimension higher than ours?
The highest.
But if that's true, well, you could never prove them.
Yes and no. The only way to understand higher dimensions is to use the dimensions we already have.
Josh looked at him, waiting for more.
Let's pretend this sheet of water floating in front of us has only 2 dimensions. It has length.
He ran his finger across the longer side of the projection.
And it has width.
He motioned to the shorter side.
But it has no height, no tallness. In other words, let's say there's a sideways and a back and forth, but no up and down.
Josh nodded.
Now, let's pretend there are people living in this 2-dimensional world, a world that's completely flat. They would understand back and forth, but they would have no understanding of up and down, correct?
Again, Josh nodded.
And how would we, in the next dimension higher, in the 3rd dimension, appear to them?
If they looked up, they'd see us like giants staring down at them.
No, they wouldn't know how to look up. Remember, they have no up and down. All they have in their 2-dimensional world is back and forth and sideways.
Well, then I guess they'd never be able to see us at all.
Precisely. Does that mean we wouldn't be here?
No, we'd be here. And we could see everything about them all the time. From one end of this projection to the other. We could see their whole life.
And if we wanted them to see us, what would we do?
I guess we'd have to get down to their level.
Josh began to chuckle.
It would sure be a shock to them, though.
He reached toward the floating projection.
I mean, it would be like, poof.
He stuck his finger into the image.
We'd suddenly appear, then poof.
He pulled out his finger.
We'd suddenly disappear.
But would we really disappear?
No. Like I said, we'd be there all the time, but to them, we'd be like these...
Josh came to a stop. The thought boggled his mind. He looked up to Bud, his eyes growing wide with understanding.
To them, what would we be like, Josh?
After a moment, Josh slowly spoke the words.
To them, we'd be like... We'd be all-knowing, all-seeing.
Josh swallowed hard. Then after another pause, he concluded.
To them, we'd be like God.
Chapter 8. Choices.
Dozing off was the last thing Denise had in mind, particularly after Gertie's lecture about leaving them. But after a day of school, traveling across dimensions, visiting the center, nearly seeing Imager ceasing to exist, being rewoven, the welcome ceremony, and all the hours of fun with Gus and Gertie, well, she didn't have much choice. She was just going to lie down for a second to rest her eyes. Unfortunately, that second turned into nearly an hour. An illusionist can do a lot of damage in almost an hour. The first thing that Denise noticed when she rose to her feet and looked toward the platform was that the wall she had created had a hole in it. How odd. The second thing she noticed was that on the other side of the wall, just a hair's breadth from the edge, were Gus's ripples and waves.
Gus!
She raced to the platform.
Gus, get away from the edge! Gus, what are you doing?
But Gus couldn't hear her. He was too close to the edge. The roar was too loud. Desperation gripped Denise. Any second Gus would lose his balance. Any second he would fall onto the floor and be destroyed. What could she do? What could be done? Then she remembered. The machine. She spun to the microphone and yelled,
Machine! Pick up Gus and put him back into the center of...
Not so fast, dear heart.
The voice sent a chill through Denise. She recognized it at once. She had heard it a dozen times in her dreams. She had heard it high over the trees of Keegarp. But now it came from somewhere on the platform.
What are you doing here?
Denise tried to push back the fear as she searched for a telltale ripple in the liquid light.
Where are you?
I'm right over here.
Where?
Why, with Gertie, of course.
Denise stifled a gasp. The illusionist. With Gertie.
Machine? Show me Gertie!
Immediately, Gertie's image flickered onto the screen overhead, and beside her, another creature who looked almost identical to her. The chill Denise had felt earlier grew to a cold numbness. This other thing was not her creation.
Hi, Denny.
Hi, Gertie.
Denise desperately searched the platform for their location. There, she spotted them. 2 tiny ripples near the center. She continued talking, trying to keep her voice calm and steady. Whatever was happening, she didn't want to scare her sensitive little friend.
What's going on, Gertie? What's Gus doing?
Oh, he's just exercising his free will.
His what?
The lady here explained it all to us. If Gus wants to play at the edge, he has every right to.
The illusionist agreed.
That's right.
Her voice was smooth and seductive.
Otherwise, you'd be living in a prison, wouldn't you?
Uh-huh, and Denny wouldn't want that.
No, of course she wouldn't. Because Denny loves you, doesn't she?
With her whole heart.
Suddenly, there was a piercing scream. Denise spun back to the edge of the platform. The little ripples that surrounded Gus were gone. Instead, there was just a pinpoint glimmer of reflection falling from the platform. It was Gus. Without thinking, Denise dove toward the glimmer, arm outstretched, hand open. It was close, but somehow, just before she hit the floor, she felt the faintest tickle inside her palm. Gus had landed safely in her open hand.
Whee!
Gus shouted as Denise rolled onto her back and struggled to her feet.
That was something! Hey, Gertie, if you can hear me, you ought to come over here and try this!
What are you doing? You could have killed yourself. Gus! Gus!
It will do no good, dear heart. He can't hear you. You know that. Not near the edge.
Fine, then I'll put him back here in the middle where he...
But he doesn't want to be in the middle. He wants to be at the edge.
I know that, but...
She's got a point, Denny.
It was Gertie again, just as sweet and thoughtful as ever.
You wouldn't want to make him live someplace he doesn't want to. You want him to have free will, right?
There was that phrase again. Already Denise was beginning to hate it. For a moment she was tempted to shout, "I don't care about any stupid free will. I'm the boss and what I say goes." But she didn't. Somehow she knew that being a demanding bully wasn't exactly what their friendship was about. So she tried reason.
Look, I know that's what he wants, to play on the edge, but I also know it'll kill him, so I have to save him.
But you already did, and he chose not to listen.
There was no missing the anger growing in Denise's voice.
But he listened to you just fine, didn't he?
I have my ways.
Yeah, well, I have mine too.
With determination, Denise turned to the microphone.
Machine, I want you to take this stranger here, and I want you to...
Hold on, Missy.
Denise stopped.
So what are you going to do? Destroy me?
The thought had crossed my mind.
That's rich. So is that what you do? Destroy anyone who disagrees with you?
Gertie's little voice was also growing angry at the illusionist.
No, of course she wouldn't. Denny isn't that way. Are you, Denny?
Well, no.
Denise faltered.
Of course not.
See? Denny loves us.
The illusionist sneered.
Love? You call this love? Making people live where they don't want to live, destroying those who don't agree with her? That is not love.
Once again, the tops of Denise's ears started to burn. She'd had enough talk. Now it was time for action.
Machine, I want you to take this thing and...
I guarantee you.
In spite of herself, Denise stopped to listen.
If you destroy me, I guarantee that Gus and Gertie will never love you on their own. They'll only pretend to love you. They'll be afraid that if they don't, you'll destroy them, just as you did me.
Denise's head began to swim. She knew that there was some truth to the illusionist's words. She also knew that she wanted to completely wipe the creature off the face of the platform. And if those weren't enough emotions flying around, there was also her worry about Gus.
Why are you doing this to us? Things were so good before. Everything was so perfect.
Since when is a dictatorship perfect?
But I'm no dictator. I'm...
Hey, are you going to put me down or what?
Denise looked back into her palm.
Put me on the edge. Put me on the edge. I want to jump off again. I want to jump off.
Denise stared into her hand, angry at the tears welling up in her eyes.
Gus, don't you see? It will kill you.
Put me down. I want to jump off again. I want to jump off.
Gus, please. Please listen to me. Gus!
By now the tears were forming faster than Denise could blink them away.
Cry all you want. But he won't hear you. It was his choice to go to the edge, and now he will never hear you.
The words pierced Denise's heart. One of her closest and best friends was trying to kill himself. No, he was more than a best friend. He was a part of her. A part of her was trying to kill himself, and there seemed nothing she could do to stop him.
Gus! Please!
But there was no answer except...
Put me down! Put me down! I want to jump off again! I want to jump off!
Isn't there...
She looked back to the platform where the illusionist was, hoping for some way, any way out.
Isn't there something I can do?
Not a thing.
Denise looked back at her palm.
Put me down! I want to jump off! I want to jump off!
She stood a long moment, listening, thinking. The illusionist was right. Denise could demand that Gus stay in the middle, but then she'd be a dictator. She could build an impossibly thick wall around him, but then she'd be a prison guard. She could wipe out the illusionist, but then she'd be a murderer. The realization pressed heavily upon Denise's chest, making it difficult to breathe. The knot in her throat continued to tighten, but there was nothing she could do. She saw that now. Absolutely nothing.
Gus, please.
Put me down! Put me down!
Denise remained listening to his demands, her mind racing and probing every possibility, but there was no way out. She pleaded one final time.
Gus!
But his answer was the same. Then, ever slowly, Denise lowered her hand back toward the edge of the platform.
Goodbye. Goodbye, my friend.
Put me down! Put me down!
Goodbye.
He leaped from her hand, and she saw the ripples as he landed back in the liquid light.
Don't worry, Denny.
She looked back to the monitor and saw Gertie. Her little friend was also crying.
You still have me, and I'll never leave you. I promise I'll never leave you.
Denise tried to smile. Good old Gertie. Always the sensitive, big-hearted Gertie. Oh, but wait! Suddenly a thought came to mind. Of course, why hadn't she thought of it before? Well, it was a long shot, but maybe... Once again, Gus was racing to the edge of the platform and leaping off. Immediately, Denise slid her hand underneath the edge and caught him.
What are you doing? You're depriving him of his free will.
But Denise paid no attention.
Gertie! Gertie, will you do me a favor?
Of course, Denny, whatever you want.
Will you give a message to Gus?
Now wait a minute. That's not fair.
Of course it's fair. He may not be able to hear me, but there's nothing saying I can't write him a note.
Put me down! Put me down!
Unfair! Unfair!
But Denise no longer listened.
Machine! Write a message. Put it on something that will last and see to it that Gertie gets it.
The machine hummed a brief moment in preparation and awaited further orders.
This is unfair! Stop it at once!
Put me down! Put me down!
But Denise wasn't stopping for anyone. She'd found the solution. Speaking to the machine, she ordered,
Have the message read, "Do not jump off the edge. It will kill you."
Put me down! Put me down!
Gus squirmed in her hand.
Unfair! Unfair!
The machine gave a faint crackle. Suddenly there was another ripple in the liquid light. Denise looked up to the monitor to see a large steel sign appear close to Gertie. It was more than the illusionist could bear. As quickly as the sign appeared, she disappeared. 1 minute she was there, the next minute she was gone. Denise had no idea where she went, and she hoped never to see her again. But even now she had her doubts.
Chapter 9. The Sign.
Oh, look.
Gertie sighed. She slowly drifted toward the gigantic steel sign resting on the floor of her liquid light ocean.
It's so beautiful.
Now, the truth is, it really wasn't all that beautiful, just an ordinary sign with a message engraved on it. But the fact that it came from her creator, that it came from her Denny, well, that brought tears of gratitude to young Gertie's eyes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
Denise was deeply touched. It seemed the tiniest of things brought joy to Gertie, and somehow that made Denise love her all the more.
You're so beautiful.
Gertie tenderly reached out to touch the sign.
And your letters, they're carved so perfectly.
For a moment, Denise was confused. Who was Gertie talking to? Then, realizing Gertie wasn't addressing her but the sign, Denise politely cleared her throat.
Gertie? Gertie, it's me, Denny. I'm still up here.
Oh, sorry. I knew that.
Now listen, I need you to take that message to...
Put me down! Put me down!
It was Gus. He was still in her palm. She lowered her hand and let him jump back onto the edge of the platform. She quickly returned to Gertie, who had already resumed her conversation.
Wonderful sign. Perfect sign.
Gertie?
Your letters say such truth, such...
Gertie.
But Gertie was so busy admiring the sign that she barely heard.
Gertie?
That did the trick.
Oh, hi, Denny?
But even as she answered, she sounded a little confused, a little distracted.
What were we talking about?
Will you ask Gus to read this sign?
Of course I would. I'd love to.
Thank you. I'll just order the machine to move it over to him, and then you can show him.
Oh, no, I can carry it.
Denise couldn't help smiling. Once again, she was moved by her friend's love and desire to help. But she didn't need her help.
That's okay. There's no need for you.
No, I'd love to carry it for you.
Thanks, Gertie, but I don't think...
You're so beautiful.
Gertie's voice was growing dreamy again.
Your letters are so perfect, so full of truth. I'll carry you everywhere you want to go.
Gertie, it's just a sign. You're talking to
I'll carry you anywhere, forever and ever.
Gertie! Gertie!
But Gertie no longer answered. Before Denise could stop her, she took the huge sign into her 4 hands and, with great effort, heaved it onto her back. It was so heavy that she sank into the sandy ocean floor. It was so big and bulky that it stretched out far over her head. But she forced herself to start walking. The awful weight caused her to groan with every step, but Gertie seemed happy to bear that weight. Honored to bear it. She would do anything for Denny. Anything.
Gertie?
Denise felt a twinge of panic.
Gertie, listen to me.
But Gertie no longer heard. The steel plate that stretched over her head blocked all sound from above.
Gertie, listen to me.
Gertie continued to stagger forward, groaning under the weight, deaf to Denise's voice. It was as if she didn't need to listen to her now, as if she had more important things to do.
Please, Gertie.
Denise could feel the emotion rising to her throat. Could it be? First she had lost Gus, and now...
Gertie! Gertie, listen to me!
But her voice continued to bounce off the steel plate, never reaching Gertie's ears. Suddenly, Denise began to feel very, very alone.
You're cutting me off. Gertie, please, don't do this.
There was no answer. Gus gave another scream as he jumped from the platform. Again, Denise leaped forward to catch him, but again, at his insistence, she put him back on the edge, none too gently this time.
Hey, watch it!
Then he started his run toward the edge again. Denise was lost. Something had to be done. Gertie could never carry that sign, not for long. She wasn't created to carry it. She'd wear herself out. In desperation, Denise turned back to the machine and gave another order.
Machine, another sign.
The machine hummed in preparation.
Have it read, "Listen to me."
The machine gave a faint crackle, and immediately the sign appeared in front of Gertie. But to Denise's horror, Gertie's gruntings and groanings grew twice as loud. Denise looked back to the screen. Instead of obeying the second sign, Gertie had placed it onto her back with the first one.
No!
She was too late. Now Gertie's burden was doubly hard to carry. Now it was doubly hard for her to hear Denise's warnings.
Gertie! Please don't do this to yourself. Please listen to me.
Feeling a little lightheaded from all the emotion, Denise grabbed the edge of the platform for support and looked back to watch Gertie's ripples of light moving slower and slower. The poor thing was obviously wearing herself out. Denise looked back to the screen. The weight was causing Gertie to sink deeper into the sandy bottom. With every step she took, she sank deeper and deeper. In a matter of minutes, she was waist deep in the sand and still sinking. Soon, very soon, the ocean floor would swallow her. The sand would cover her neck, her mouth, her nose, and then in her stubborn desire to serve Denise, Gertie would suffocate and kill herself. Gus screamed as he jumped off the edge. Denise dove forward and caught him, then returned to Gertie. But Gertie was gone. There were no sounds, no ripples, no image on the screen.
Gertie!
Desperate, Denise shoved her free hand deep into the liquid light where she had last seen Gertie. It was an impulsive move that could have crushed her little friend, but she had to do something. She pulled it out, hoping against hope that she had somehow caught Gertie. At the same time, Gus continued his demands.
Put me down! Put me down!
Then Denise heard her. She was coughing up sand and screaming hysterically, but there was no mistaking Gertie's voice. She was in her hand.
Let me go! Let me go!
For a moment, the tiniest relief filled Denise, but only for a moment.
Put me down!
Let me go!
Put me down!
Let me
Put
go!
me down!
Let me
Put
this! You two are killing yourselves, don't you see? Stop it!
Put me down.
But neither was listening.
Put me down!
Let me go!
Put me down!
Let me go!
Put me down!
Let
Put
me
me
go!
down!
Let me go!
Put me down!
Let me go!
Put me
Let
down!
me go!
Put me
Let
down!
me go!
Put me down!
Then another voice joined in. Denise wasn't sure where it came from, but there was no mistaking who it was.
You must let them go, dear heart, or they will be your prisoners. Without free will, you will become their dictator.
But they'll kill themselves!
Moisture again filled Denise's eyes. She was cut off from both her friends now. Not only that, but they were destroying themselves. Her two best friends were destroying themselves, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. Her throat ached, and the pressure inside her chest was so great that she had to fight for breath.
Please, Gus! Gertie, please! You two have to listen to me!
Her head grew lighter as she struggled for breath. Hot tears spilled from her eyes and ran down her face.
You need me! Listen to me! You need me!
But there was no answer, only their continual demands.
Put me down!
Let me go!
Put me
Let
down!
me go!
Put me down!
Please!
Denise's breathing had turned to ragged gasps. Her vision began to blur. The hours without sleep, the intense emotions, and the ongoing fight to save those she so deeply loved was more than she could handle.
Please! Please!
But it did no good. By now both Gus and Gertie were in a mindless rage. Gus was the first to add the new phrase.
I hate you!
I hate you!
I hate you! I hate you! I hate
The
you!
words hit Denise hard, slamming into her gut and breaking her heart.
I hate you!
Her head began to reel.
I hate you!
She had only fainted once in her life. She hated the feeling then and she hated it now. She had to fight it off, she knew it, but she also knew something else. She knew the illusionist was right. She knew that there was nothing more she could do for them. Slowly, sadly, Denise unclenched her first hand. Her mind screamed with anguish as Gus jumped off into the liquid light and back to the edge of the platform for the very last time. Then, no longer able to see through her tears or to stop the room as it started to spin, Denise opened her other hand. Suddenly she closed it and pulled it back, yelling,
No, I can't!
You have no choice, dear heart. You know that. No choice.
Denise wept openly now. The illusionist was right. There was nothing she could do. Once again she opened her hand and slowly brought it toward the platform. Once again she felt the stab of deep pain in her heart as Gertie dove into the liquid light and swam toward her precious signs. Denise tried to speak, to say something, but as she clung helplessly to the platform, no words would come. The tears turned to sobs, gulping, gut-wrenching sobs. She had never cried so hard, never felt such pain. She wasn't just losing friends, she was losing her heart. It was cold inside the machine now, very cold. She could no longer stand to watch. The pressure was too great. Hanging onto the edge of the platform, Denise slowly eased herself down to the floor. The sobs continued, only now they were silent sobs, sobs of hopelessness. She released her grip on the platform and drew herself into a tiny little ball on the cold concrete floor. The pain was unbearable.
Chapter 10. Another Last Chance.
Across the river with Bud and the guys, Josh was learning more about Imager. He didn't believe everything they said, but gradually, scientific theory by scientific theory and mathematical formula by mathematical formula, he was beginning to realize there must be somebody out there.
But what about the future? Everybody, you guys, the Weaver, folks at Fayrah, they all say this Imager knows our future, that he knows what I'm going to do before I do.
Aristophanes, Listerque, and Bud all nodded in agreement.
But that's impossible.
Impossible more, that does he.
How?
That's simple. If you would just imagine.
No imaginings. Your theory about higher dimensions is interesting, but that's all it is, theory. I need proof, either through scientific observations or mathematical equations.
Aristophanes and Lister-Q exchanged nervous glances. But Bud simply smiled and pushed several buttons on Olga. Immediately, a paper several feet long rolled out of a slot.
What's that?
It's your future.
Yeah, right.
But Bud was perfectly serious.
Every one of your personality traits is given a number, see?
He held the paper out, but an immediate frown crossed his face.
Oh, this is strange. All the information seems to be printed upside down.
Josh looked over Bud's shoulder a moment and then, without a word, gently took the paper from him and turned it right side up.
Thank you. That's much better. Now, where were we?
Something about my personality traits having a number?
Precisely. You see, your sports abilities are number 706 here, and your interest in science is 245. Your desire to please people is...
Wait a minute. How do you know all that about me?
We know everything about you.
Everything?
Everything. Remember, we look down from a higher dimension.
Oh, yeah, right.
Josh swallowed a little uncomfortably. Suddenly, he wasn't so thrilled that everything he did was always being watched.
Anyway, everything about you is given a number, and everything that could happen to you is given another number. Then, using the laws of probability, we run these numbers through the computer, and it tells us exactly what you'll do in every situation.
What if I want to change my mind?
You can change your mind as often as you want, but we know what your final decision will be.
No kidding?
And we can predict how that decision will affect other people in their mathematical future.
And if you put all of our mathematical futures together...
We know the entire future of your world.
Incredible.
No, just Imager's mathematics.
Can I see it?
No, I don't think so.
Why not? It's my future.
According to these figures, you would try to alter these numbers.
No way.
Yes, you would.
Absolutely not.
Just as you did try to alter the Weaver's tapestry?
Well, that was different.
How?
Well, because...
Josh was running out of arguments. As much as he hated to admit it, Bud had a point.
Well, okay, I guess maybe I might try. Just a little.
The group chuckled quietly. Even Josh had to smile. Then an idea came to mind.
What about Denny? Could I see her future?
Bud glanced to Aristophanes and Lister-Q. They hesitated a moment, then nodded in approval. Bud reached over and pressed another set of Olga buttons. Immediately, another long sheet of paper shot out. Bud picked it up and began showing the figures to Josh.
See, this number here is your friend's stubbornness. This one is her doubts over Imager's love, the reason she came here in the first place.
Josh nodded.
This is her love for the creatures she's just created over at the machine. This is...
Bud's voice trailed off.
What?
No, this can't be right.
Immediately, Bud repushed the buttons on the computer, and immediately another piece of paper shot out.
What's wrong?
Bud quickly scanned the paper.
Bud?
There was no missing the growing concern in his voice.
Bud?
Finally, the scientist spoke.
According to these calculations, Denny is experiencing a love for her creations similar to Imager's.
Well, that's great. That's what she wanted to understand, right?
Still staring at the figures, Bud could only shake his head.
But too similar.
Too similar how? Similar love. How to Imager?
Slowly, Bud looked up.
Completely. A love so similar that it would destroy itself to save its creation.
A chill washed over the group. Then, without a word, Aristophanes quickly turned and started waddling down the path toward the bridge.
Where are you going?
The pudgy creature called over his shoulder.
Our tushes should be a-moving, 'cause I'm afraid if they don't, Denny's chances of living are less than remote.
Denise wasn't sure when the idea first came. But there, curled up on the cold floor, she realized she hadn't tried everything. There was still one last thing she could do to save her friends. She struggled to her knees, then rose unsteadily to her feet. A wave of dizziness swept over her, but she wouldn't give in to it. Those were her friends on that platform, and nothing would stop her from saving them. She glanced quickly over to the edge. Gus's ripples were still there. Good. That meant he hadn't jumped off yet. Apparently, he enjoyed teetering on the edge as much as he did the actual falling. She glanced up to the screen for Gertie's location. To her amazement, her little friend had already reached the wall. Gertie's fierce determination surprised her. Then again, Gertie was part of her, and if there was one thing Denise had, it was determination. But Gertie was so much weaker now. As with Gus, it was only a matter of minutes before she'd destroy herself. It was an awful risk. Denise didn't even know if the machine could pull it off, let alone if she'd survive. Then there was the matter of coming back. But it was the only hope Gus and Gertie had. If they wouldn't let her help from above, then maybe, just maybe, she could help from beside.
Machine!
The machine hummed in readiness.
Put me in their world! Make me like Gus and Gertie!
The machine crackled and sparked much longer than normal. Well, this was no common request. But at last it shrunk Denise to the size of a pinhead and transported her into Gus and Gertie's world. The whole process caught her a little off guard. Becoming the size of a pinhead is not your everyday experience. Then there was the matter of swimming and breathing in the liquid light. And finally, let's not forget the 4 arms. It took lots of concentration not to tangle them up, and even more not to accidentally clobber herself with them. But finally she got the hang of it, and just in time.
Who are you?
The voice was faint and weak, but Denise immediately recognized it.
Gertie?
She quickly looked around.
Gertie, where are you?
I'm right here. Down here.
Denise looked down to the sandy ocean floor and let out a gasp. By now Gertie had sunk up to her neck, yet she still hung on to the heavy signs, holding them high over her head. Nothing would make her let go.
Quick, let me have those!
Denise swam toward Gertie and grabbed hold of the signs.
What are you doing? These are Denny's signs. Let go of them. Let go of them.
Gertie, give them to me.
Let go!
There was a brief struggle, but being stuck up to her neck in sand definitely hampered Gertie's efforts. Still, her 4 hands gripped the signs so tightly that it was all Denise could do to pry them loose from her. Then, despite Gertie's screams of protest, Denise raised the heavy signs high over her head and threw them to the side.
No!
She started to fight and claw her way out of the sand. Denise reached down to help, but Gertie would have none of it. At last she dug herself out, but instead of throwing her arms around her creator, as Denise had hoped and dreamed, Gertie raced for the signs and threw her arms around them.
These are Denny's. She told me to carry them.
Gertie, I am Denny! Gertie!
But Gertie wasn't listening. Instead, she comforted and soothed the signs.
Perfect signs. Beautiful signs.
She gently stroked their surfaces.
Did that mean awful creature scratch you?
Denny approached her cautiously.
Gertie? Gertie, it's me, Denny.
But there was no response as Gertie continued talking to the signs.
Gertie, please, it's...
Suddenly, Gertie turned on her.
Stay back!
She pulled the signs closer to protect them. Denise came to a stop, puzzled and perplexed.
Gertie?
I don't know who you are or what you want, but you keep your hands off my signs.
Gertie, it's me. It's Denny.
Liar!
What?
Liar! Denny would never hurt these signs. Denny would never take them away. These are good signs. Perfect signs.
She began to rock back and forth, holding them like a lost child clinging to a doll.
Of course they're good signs.
Denise cautiously resumed her approach.
That's why I made them. But look what's written on them. Look what they...
Stay back!
Denise slowed, but she wouldn't stop.
They say you have to quit hurting yourself and pay attention to me.
Stay back, I said!
But you're so busy carrying them and loving them that you don't even hear me.
These are perfect signs. Good signs.
I know they're good signs, but you're not obeying them.
By now she'd reached Gertie's side.
Denny told me to carry them.
No, I didn't.
Gently, carefully, Denise knelt beside her friend.
That was your idea. I just wanted you to obey them. You don't have to carry them.
But I...
Gertie sounded even more lost, like she wanted to believe Denise, but like it was too good to be true.
I love Denny. I love Denny, and she wants me to.
No. All I want is your safety and your friendship.
But I have to help.
Again, Denise shook her head.
By trying to help, you were cutting me off.
Gertie had started to cry.
No, that's not true. I love Denny. I didn't mean to.
I know.
Denise felt the tears well up in her own eyes. She tenderly wrapped her arms around Gertie.
I know.
Barely aware of it, Gertie returned the hug. The two of them sat there for several moments, each giving and returning the other's embrace. Slowly the anger and hurt began to fade. Slowly the love and affection began to return. Finally, Denise reached for the signs.
Here, let me help you with those. Let me take...
No!
Gertie pulled them back. She was no longer the lost girl clinging to a doll. Now she was a starved animal fighting over a scrap of meat.
These are Denny's signs! Perfect signs! Good signs!
But if you just...
Then, with fierce determination, Gertie hoisted the signs over her head and threw them onto her back.
Gertie, no!
The poor thing let out an awful groan as the weight crushed her body. But she would not stop. The signs were her life. They had been given to her, and nothing would make her part with them.
Gertie, please!
There was no answer. Gertie turned and staggered toward the hole in the wall. Every step forced a moan of agony, and every step pushed her deeper and deeper into the sand.
Gertie, please listen to me!
But Gertie would not listen to Denise. She was too busy serving her.
Chapter 11. Fight of Love.
Josh was the first to arrive outside the machine's giant doors. He was followed by Bud, Listrocue, and eventually poor Aristophanes, who, as usual, was bringing up the rear, gasping for breath.
Come on! Hurry!
At last Aristophanes arrived, wheezing out an apology.
I'm so sorry that I'm tardy, but we've run so very far, and we poets are artists, not Olympic track stars.
Josh found himself cringing. No matter how many times he'd heard Aristophanes' awful poetry, he still hadn't got used to it. He reached for the doors and with a mighty heave tried to pull them open. They wouldn't budge, not an inch.
Wrong. What's?
It must be locked.
Josh tried to pull again with exactly the same results. All three looked to Bud. Suddenly he remembered.
The key. Of course.
He reached into his coat pocket as he crossed to the keyhole.
Can't get inside without the key.
But there was nothing in that pocket, so he tried the other.
Yes, sir, it always helps to have the key.
Still nothing. Next he tried his pants pocket.
The key.
Then finally, turning to the group, he asked,
By the way, have any of you seen it?
They stared at him blankly.
No, I guess not.
He immediately retried each pocket.
Where last used it, did you?
Why, right here at this door. I unlocked this door and then put the key someplace where I'll be sure to remember.
Where was that?
I don't remember. Oh, wait a minute. Of course. I put them someplace safe where no one could find them.
Where?
Well, right on the console beside Denny.
The group stared at him in disbelief. Once again he shrugged. Then, without a word, all four turned and began banging on the door.
Denny! Denny, can you hear us? Denny! Denny, open up!
But Denise did not answer. Apparently she couldn't hear. But the group did. And what they heard brought a look of surprise to all of their faces. It was an electronic sound, one that they all recognized.
Gertie, please! You've got to listen to me!
By now, Gertie was dragging herself through the hole in the wall. The bone-crushing weight of the signs took their toll with every step, but she had to get away. It was obvious that Denise had started to make sense, and that was something Gertie could not stand. Yet Denise wouldn't be shaken. She stayed right at her side.
Gertie, please, let me carry those. Please.
Finally, they passed through the hole and...
Hey, Gertie, who's your friend?
Denise looked ahead to see Gus. He was standing right on the edge of their world, teetering back and forth like a tightrope walker in the circus. And beyond him was an awful black void of nothingness, a void that roared and screamed as it smashed into the liquid light, a void as dark and terrifying as the one Denise had experienced on her first trip to Fayrah.
Gus, get away from there!
But Gus barely heard. The roar was too loud. Instead, he gave a grin, leaped high into the air, and made a perfect 360-degree spin. Well, almost. His right foot slipped and he started to lose his balance. Denise screamed as she started for him.
No!
But at the last second, Gus caught himself and turned to her laughing.
Listen, I don't know who you are, but you're going to have to loosen up a little. Besides, falling over the edge is the best part. Come on over here and give it a try.
Denise shook her head and shouted over the roar.
Gus, you've got to listen to me. You're going to...
But Gus wasn't listening. If she wasn't interested in his little hobby, he'd find somebody who was.
Hey, Gertie! You ought to try this!
Gertie just stood panting, slowly sinking under the heavy burden.
No, thanks. I've got these signs to carry.
Signs? What for?
They're from Denny, to make us happy. She wants us to carry them.
No, that's not true!
Happy?
Yeah, carrying them makes you happy.
Right. Looks like you're having a terrific time.
They're not so bad once you get used to them.
She adjusted the weight and grimaced slightly.
Want to try one?
Forget it! If you're looking for good times, this is the ticket!
Gertie gave a doubtful look past him and into the roaring void.
Don't worry about that. It ain't as scary as it looks.
I don't know.
What's the matter? Chicken?
Maybe.
Come on. You won't know till you try.
Don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's doing.
There was no hiding her desperation. If Gertie joined Gus on the edge, she could lose them both.
I'm not there anymore. I can't catch him. I can't catch you.
He gave a little hop and spin on one foot.
Come on, Gertie. Give it a shot. It's a real hoot.
Although she obviously tried to ignore him, Gertie gradually started to listen.
And you can bring those signs with. I mean, if you really think you have to.
I can?
Gertie, no! Gus, please!
Sure.
Gus leaped into the air, landing on all four hands. He did a little jig before hopping back to his feet.
Come on. You won't know till you try it.
Gertie readjusted her load.
You're really sure it's safe?
Hey, I'm still here, ain't I?
Gertie, no!
Gertie threw Denise a quick glance, then looked back to Gus. Denise knew exactly what she was thinking. It had been a long time since she and Gus had played together, and the memories must still be fresh in her mind. Gus had never been anything but fun, and he'd never done anything to hurt her. Why would he start now? Besides, she'd worked plenty hard serving Denise by carrying the signs, so wasn't she entitled to a little fun?
All right, but just for a bit.
She started to stagger toward him.
No!
She raced forward and leaped the few feet separating them, tackling Gertie hard to the ground. The signs fell to the sand as they rolled back and forth, all 4 feet kicking, all 8 arms flying.
Let go! Where are my signs? Let go of me!
Listen to me, Gertie, listen to me!
As they rolled around in the sand, Gus looked on, laughing.
Gertie, please!
I want my signs!
Gertie!
At last, Gertie managed to grab the closest sign. As she pulled it to herself, Denise tried to break her grip on it.
Gertie! My sign! Gertie, let me have it!
Finally, rolling onto her back, Gertie tucked her legs into her chest and kicked out. Her feet landed squarely in Denise's stomach, throwing her backward.
Ugh!
But Denise was determined. Catching her breath and crawling onto her hands and knees, she gasped.
Gertie, please!
Gertie was already reaching for the other sign. Denise staggered to her feet and lunged again. This time Gertie had a weapon. Raising the sign high over her shoulder, she leaned back like a batter waiting to hit a ball. Denise saw what was about to happen and tried to stop, but the momentum in the liquid light kept her moving forward until suddenly Gertie took the swing. The steel sliced through the liquid. Its sharp corner cut Denise hard, ripping through her clothing, cutting her deeply in the side. For a moment, all Denise saw was a look of shock on Gertie's face. She glanced down and noticed blood clouding the liquid around them. Then she saw the gash in her side, deep and ugly. And finally she felt the pain, sharp, searing, relentless. She slowly raised her eyes from the bleeding hole and looked back to Gertie. No one said a word. Everything was silent as the liquid light grew more and more cloudy. Denise tried to breathe, but every breath sent the burning, jagged pain deeper into her body. Slowly, the edges around her vision started to blur, growing white and fuzzy. Her legs were turning weak and rubbery, but only for a second. They gave out altogether, and she crumpled to the ground.
Ha! Serves her right!
Gertie continued to stare, horrified at what she had done, unsure what she would do, as the liquid light grew darker and darker and darker.
Chapter 12. Reunion.
Aristophanes! Lister Q!
The group spun around to see Josh's little brother Nathan. He had just popped in with his stuffed English bulldog, Mr. Hornsberry. Oh, and there was one other companion, Samson, the half-dragonfly, half-ladybug that had become such good friends with Denise on their last journey together.
Nathan, what are you doing here?
Samson says Denny's in some sort of trouble.
But how'd you get here?
Nathan held up another cross-dimensionalizer exactly like Listrocue's.
It's Samson's. He let me try it out. How'd I do?
Good pretty. Maybe lessons give me, should he?
Samson interrupted with a high squeal. Aristophanes answered.
Denny's in there, dying for love. But we're all out here, 'cause the door, we can't budge.
Bud answered.
Oh, the fault is mine. I left the key inside.
For a moment, the group was unsure what to do. That is, until Mr. Hornsberry spoke up.
I say, although no one is seeking my advice, would it not be advantageous for us to utilize all of our man and dog power?
So how?
Mr. Hornsberry answered in his usual, "Why am I surrounded by morons?" tone of voice.
My good man, all one need do is lift this door off its hinges.
As much as everyone hated to admit it, Mr. Hornsberry had a point. Now there was just the detail of how to do it. It was so tall and huge. Unfortunately, everyone had their own opinion, and no one was afraid to voice it. Suddenly the air was full of 100 "if you ask me's" and "we should try's" and the ever-popular "I'm telling you my way's better." On and on they argued, as if each was some sort of expert door remover. Of course, none of them were, so nothing happened, except more talking. Until finally, ever so slowly, the door began to swing open by itself.
What on earth? How do you suppose?
Then they saw the reason. While everyone was voicing their expertise, Samson simply flew in through the keyhole, unlatched the door from the inside, and, with considerable effort, pushed it open. Everyone cheered as they poured into the laboratory. But the celebration was short-lived. Denise was nowhere to be found.
Denny? Denny? Denny, where are you?
But there was no answer. Turning to Bud, Josh demanded,
What's going on?
I know.
Together they approached the deserted platform of sand and light.
What's going on?
But Bud didn't answer. He turned to the platform and ordered,
Machine?
The machine hummed loudly.
Where is Denny?
With a faint crackle, the monitor above the platform flickered. Everyone gasped as the image of Denise appeared, not because of her 4 arms or because she was lying unconscious in the liquid light. They gasped at the bleeding wound in her side.
Denny! Denise!
She can't hear you.
Listen to me.
Josh shouted as he turned his anger on Bud.
You got her in this mess. Now you get her out.
I can't. This was her decision. This was her.
Josh grabbed the little man by his lab coat and pulled him directly into his face.
I don't care whose decision it was. Do what you have to do to save her.
But...
No!
Well, the only way to save her is to reduce someone to her size and rescue her.
Do it!
But you don't understand how dangerous.
To me! Do it to me!
But...
Do it to me now!
Joshua glared at him, making it clear that he didn't have a choice. Finally, Bud nodded.
Machine.
The machine crackled in response.
Take Joshua here and...
Until all is accomplished, do not interfere.
The voice stunned Joshua. But it wasn't a voice. It was a thought that vibrated inside his head. He spun to the rest of the group, but the way their mouths hung open, he figured it had vibrated in everyone's head.
What? Who was that?
At first, no one answered. Then, with a nervous swallow, Bud spoke.
Imager.
Nobody said a word, not even Mr. Hornsberry. It was the strongest, most commanding voice Josh had ever heard, and yet, at the same time, it was the gentlest and most soothing. Then he heard another voice.
Please.
It was Denise. His eyes shot up to the monitor. She had regained consciousness and was dragging her bleeding body toward the other two multi-armed creatures. One stood on the very edge of the platform, the other was being crushed by two large rectangular plates of steel on its back.
Gertie! Gus!
But the creatures did not answer. Instead, the bigger one turned to the smaller one.
Hit her! Hit her again!
The smaller one hesitated. Denise continued to approach.
Gertie!
Hit her! You have to stop her! She won't quit unless you stop her!
Again, the smaller one hesitated.
Hit her! Hit her! Hit her!
Reluctantly, the smaller one raised the steel plates high overhead and brought them down hard onto Denise's back. Everyone in the lab cried out as the blow smashed her to the ground. And yet Denise wouldn't stop. She slowly rose to her hands and knees and continued toward them.
Please.
Once again, the smaller creature raised the plates, and once again she slammed them hard into Denise's back. Josh could take no more. That was his friend up there on the screen, and, imager or not, he wasn't going to stand and watch her beaten to death. He shouted at the thought or the voice or whatever it was that was inside his head.
What type of logic is this?
There was no response, only silence, and nervous coughs among the group.
Answer me!
More silence.
You claim to be so logical, so loving. Then answer me! Answer me!
Finally, the voice spoke, but it wasn't angry. It was tender and understanding, but it was also firm, very firm.
Until all is accomplished, do not interfere.
But she's dying! She's killing herself! Where's the logic in that? Answer me! Answer me!
The response rang loud and clear and very, very gentle.
Until all is accomplished, do not interfere.
Until what is accomplished? Well, how will we know? What can we do?
There was no answer. Josh repeated.
How will we know?
But the voice did not answer. Apparently it said all that it intended to say. Now there was only silence. Josh sighed loudly in frustration and turned to the others. Everyone looked equally baffled and confused. Everyone but Samson. The little fellow flew closer to the platform and seemed to be waiting. Denise had often told Josh how close she and the little bug had become, how of all the creatures in Fayrah their personalities seemed the most similar, and, although the little guy said nothing, Josh could tell he was thinking and waiting. For now there was nothing they could do. Imager had spoken. 3 times he had spoken. They could only watch now, and they could only obey. As Gertie continued clutching the signs, their weight continued to drive her deeper and deeper into the sand. But that was nothing compared to Denise's pain. Again and again Gertie had to strike her, and again Denise rose and continued toward them. Nothing would stop her. Not the gaping wound in her side that continued darkening the liquid, not the brutal beating of the signs. Granted, each time Denise rose, she rose a little slower, but she rose nonetheless. She had to in order to save her friends. She had backed them up to the edge of the platform, just inches from the roaring black emptiness.
Please, please, what do you want? What do you want from us? I want you to live.
You're crazy! We are living!
Denise shook her head and with great effort reached for the signs.
Please.
Gus shouted at Gertie over the roaring void.
You're holding back! Stop holding back and hit her with everything you have! Make her hurt so much that she'll never bother us again!
Denise looked up. She could see Gertie didn't like this, not one bit. Gertie was already crying over the pain she'd inflicted. Still, the look in her eyes said that she believed something had to be done.
Go ahead! Everything you got!
Gertie took a trembling breath.
Go ahead! Don't hold back!
Another breath.
If you don't, she'll never give us rest! Go ahead! Go ahead!
Finally, Gertie lifted the signs high over her head. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and...
No!
Another voice had joined them. Denise recognized it instantly.
Who are you?
She's our friend, the one who taught us about free will. Don't listen to her. She's the illusionist. She'll kill...
Destroy her!
What?
Gus was obviously surprised at the outburst. The illusionist cleared her throat and regained control.
It's only a suggestion. After all, I don't want to interfere with your free will. But if you ask me, hitting her is not enough. You must destroy her by throwing her off the edge.
But she'll come back. I always have.
Trust me, she won't come back. Not this time.
Gertie was obviously confused.
But why? Why do we have to destroy her?
It's for her own good. It's the kindest thing to do, dear heart. Otherwise, she'll just keep coming at you, and you'll just have to keep hurting her.
Moved with pity, Gertie looked down at Denise. The illusionist continued.
You've inflicted such pain upon her already. But no matter how much she bleeds, no matter how often you strike her, she will not give up.
Gertie nodded sadly.
It deeply grieves me. But the only way you can stop her, the only way you can put her out of her misery, is to destroy her.
The illusionist pretended to have a catch in her throat. Then, turning to Gus, the illusionist had an entirely different approach.
The wretched thing has no pride. If you don't destroy her, she'll always create problems. Just look at the way her blood is darkening your perfect ocean. Just listen to the way she's nagging and begging. She'll never give you rest.
Denise watched Gus, hoping he'd see the lie.
Do it! You can keep those perfect signs forever and ever. And Gus, you can jump off that edge any time you want. No one will stop you. No one will stop either of you. Certainly not me. I wouldn't dream of stopping you.
The two glanced to each other and then down to Denise. She no longer had the strength to speak. She could only shake her head, pleading to them with her eyes. The illusionist pretended to stifle a yawn.
When you stop to think about it, you really have no other choice.
Gus was the first to agree. He ordered Gertie,
Grab her arms!
There's no other way?
Gertie's voice was filled with pain.
You hurt her, didn't you?
Gertie nodded and slowly stooped down to Denise.
I'm sorry, but this really is for your best.
Denise violently shook her head, but Gertie would not listen. Instead, holding her signs high above with one set of hands, Gertie stooped down and took Denise's face with the other.
Maybe if you'd stop trying to help us. Maybe if you'd just let us have our way instead of always...
Denise shook her head. She opened her mouth to explain, but was overcome with anguish. Slowly, sadly, Gertie rose to her feet.
I'm sorry.
Tears streamed down her cheeks.
I'm so sorry.
Then, taking Denise's arms with her two free hands, she gently raised her off the ground. Denise clenched her eyes shut. The pain was too great, but it was not the pain of her wounds, or even the thought of being destroyed. It was her breaking heart. Gus picked up her feet. Now she was suspended between the two of them.
On the count of 3.
Gertie nodded.
1.
They swung her out over the edge and back.
2.
They swung her further out and back.
3.
But at the last second, using what little strength she had, Denise lunged for the signs in Gertie's other hands. She latched onto them as she swung out the third and final time, the momentum ripping them from Gertie's grasp. Before they could catch her, Denise slipped from their hands and it started to fall.
My signs! My beautiful signs!
Denise and the signs tumbled and fell into the roaring darkness.
Chapter 13. To the Rescue.
The group inside the machine screamed as Denise fell. Everyone but Samson. While the others had been staring at the monitor over their heads, Samson had hovered near the platform, carefully searching the liquid light. He had spotted Gus and Gertie's location by the slight ripples near the edge. As soon as Denise began to fall, he made his move.
Samson! What are you?
But there was no time to explain. Imager had said, until all is accomplished. Well, as far as Samson could tell, all had been accomplished. Now the little guy couldn't waste a second. He swooped toward the platform's edge, and just as Denise had done so many times with Gus, Samson managed to spot the tiny pinpoint glimmer of a reflection and raced toward it. Faster and faster she fell. Swifter and swifter he flew. He saw the floor coming up, but it didn't matter. Finally, he was in position. He quickly swooped under her. But they were traveling too fast. Although she landed briefly on his back, Denise's speed forced her to tumble and roll across him until she shot off the other side and continued to fall. Samson spun back around and dove after her again. The floor was much closer, much, much closer. Now common sense told Samson to pull out of the dive before it was too late. If he didn't, they'd both smash into the floor. It was better to lose one life than two. That's what his mind was saying. But Samson's heart was bigger than his mind. He folded back his wings and he dove even faster. The floor raced toward him. Now he was even with Denise. In just another second he would be able to swoop underneath and let her land on his back again. Unfortunately, they didn't have another second. In desperation, Samson unfolded his right wing and thrust it into the roaring wind toward Denise. The rushing air screamed and tugged at the wing, nearly ripping it out of its socket. But Samson endured the pain and continued to stretch his wing until it was finally beneath her. Then he felt it, Denise's tiny presence landing on him. In a flash, he reversed course, using only one wing, buzzing it twice as hard, struggling even more to navigate with it until he finally zoomed up. It was close, so close that he actually felt the lab's floor brush against his hind legs as he pulled up, but he made it. As he rose, he lifted his right wing until Denise rolled down it and onto his back. Now he could use both wings, and now at last she was safe. For Denise, it had been quite a landing. She'd had the breath knocked out of her, but she didn't complain. She was just grateful to have breath to be knocked out. She was so tiny that she had no idea what she'd landed upon. As far as she knew, it was some sort of elevator that was quickly shooting upward. But who had ever heard of an elevator with a gauzy, semi-transparent floor and a huge flickering tail light in the back? Yet Denise had little time to wonder, for suddenly the platform came back into view, and there, standing on its edge, were Gus and Gertie, both staring out at her in amazement. On the wall behind them, the illusionist was jumping up and down, screaming,
Unfair! Unfair! Unfair!
For a moment, the elevator slowed and drew closer to the edge. Gus and Gertie came so close, Denise could have reached out and touched them, if she'd had the strength. The illusionist continued to scream,
Unfair! Unfair!
Denise called.
I'll be back.
But she was so weak her voice was only a whisper, barely audible over the roaring void. Still, somehow, they seemed to understand. Gertie was the first to nod. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Gus joined in. And then, was it just her imagination, or had the slightest trace of a smile started to cross their faces? Her elevator began to rise up and away. Faster and faster it rose. Gus and Gertie soon shrank until they became little dots and then nothing at all. But in her mind, Denise still saw them. She suspected she would always see them. Once again she whispered,
I'll be back. I promise I'll be back.
For the next several days, Denise did little but eat and sleep. Once the machine had transformed her to normal size, the group had whisked her out of the lab and off to Samson's home in Fayrah. Well, at least to a huge tent they had erected beside Samson's home. Humans are a bit large for insect homes, especially newlywed insects just starting out. Here she would rest until she was strong enough to return to the upside-down kingdom. According to the doctor, her mind and body had been through great trauma, and they both needed time to heal.
But what about Mom? What about Josh's grandpa? They'll be worried sick.
Listro Q assured her.
Worry, don't you?
Aristophanes agreed.
The old boy's right. Remember, we're running in time much faster than you reckon. And for us, what's a week to them is but a second.
Right is he. Teapot, remember in Grandpa's shop that dropped you?
The one that floated?
Listro Q nodded.
Floating, still is it?
Denise looked at him in wonder. But before she could say anything, Violet, Samson's new bride, buzzed in and began chattering a mile a second.
What's she saying?
Aristophanes gave a hasty explanation.
She's saying you're her guest and that there isn't a doubt you'll be getting some rest because, well, she's throwing us out.
Denise couldn't hold back a giggle as she watched Violet buzz and dive bomb the guests sitting inside her tent.
All right, we're going.
They raised their arms and stumbled toward the exit.
Come on, Vi, give us a break. Samson, will you call her off?
But Samson didn't call her off, and Violet didn't stop until every one of them was out of the tent.
That's quite a wife you have.
Denise grinned over to Samson. Samson chattered back a proud reply, but was cut short as he too was shooed out of the tent. 6 more days passed before the doctor finally gave Denise permission to travel. And once word spread that they were going, Samson's yard was filled with hundreds of well-wishers and bon voyageurs. Some of them had never even met Denise, but they had all heard of her deeds. The doctor gave her a warning as he changed the dressing and bandages on her wound for the final time.
Now you take care of this side. It'll be a while before it's completely healed.
Denise nodded.
And I'm afraid you'll always have a scar, quite a large one.
Denise looked down to the red, jagged line that ran from the middle of her ribs all the way to her hip.
That's okay. It'll help me remember.
Then, before she knew it, tears filled her eyes and began to fall, just as they had so many times throughout the week.
Thinking about Gus and Gertie again?
She gave a quick nod and tried to brush the tears away.
And Imager, too.
Looking up, she spotted Aristophanes and Listro Q standing nearby. She continued softly.
He really does care for us, doesn't he?
They nodded in silence.
I mean, if he only feels a fraction of what I felt for Gus and Gertie.
More many times for us each does he.
Denise could only shake her head in amazement.
How can he stand it? The joy, the pain.
Barely aware, she reached up and touched the scar in her side, once again remembering.
How can he stand it?
For a long moment, everyone stood in silence, until suddenly...
Step back, please. Coming through. Yes, we are. Stand back.
The silence was shattered by the weaver's entrance. Following behind him were 2 of his assistants, each carrying an easel and a small tapestry. Behind them squeezed in several of the folks who had been patiently waiting in the yard outside. Before Denise knew it, her tent was packed so tightly that no amount of buzzing and dive bombing by Violet could unpack it.
Oh, there you are. Getting better, are we?
She nodded.
Good.
Then turning back to his assistants, he called,
Just set those up anywhere, boys.
What are you doing here?
Rumor has it you're concerned about Gus and Gertie. Yes, you are. Well, no need to be. I brought their tapestries along to show you before you go.
Gus and Gertie have tapestries?
Of course. You don't think I'd let something like that slip by, do you?
Well, no, I guess...
The assistants had just placed the tapestries up on their easels. The weaver gave a nod, and with a dramatic flair, they removed the tapestry covers. The crowd gasped, then broke into applause. The weaver grinned and nodded. Then, turning to Denise, he asked,
So, What do you think?
Denise could only stare. They were more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Each thread shimmered and danced with light. Each design, down to the tiniest detail, perfectly captured their personalities. In fact, the patterns were so perfect that as she stared, she could practically see and hear Gus and Gertie again. Unfortunately, this only brought on another grimace of pain and more tears.
Ah, come on, they're not that ugly.
Denise shook her head.
No, they were beautiful, wonderful.
What do you mean, were? As you can see by their length, both Gus and Gertie will be living for many more epochs.
They're still alive?
Well, yes, of course. As are their children, and their children's children, and their...
They have children, too?
Once again, the weaver tried to overlook the interruption.
Of course. Thousands of them. And according to this thread here...
They have thousands of children?
If you keep interrupting me, child, we won't get through this before you leave.
Denise nodded and did her best to remain silent, though her mind reeled with excitement. She had just naturally thought that Gus had talked Gertie into jumping off the edge with him. But the fact that they were still alive and that they actually had children, well, the possibility had her so excited she could barely sit still.
Now, where was I? Oh, yes. This thread here indicates Gus's continual fascination with the edge. But instead of leaping off, he has taken Gertie's advice and has devoted his life to studying it.
Studying it?
Yes. Scientific evaluation, I believe they call it.
Gus has become a scientist?
Yes. Well, I'm afraid Bud has taken over leadership while you were away and has had some impact upon...
Oh, no.
Josh groaned good-naturedly.
Bud is their leader?
I hope he doesn't drop anything on them.
Others in the tent also chuckled. Apparently, Bud's reputation for grace was known far and wide.
And just as Gus has continued his scientific studies, Gertie has been writing and teaching her children poetry.
Denise kept listening, hanging on to every word. The news was so good, so very, very good.
And do you see this deep scarlet thread here?
The weaver turned to the group while pointing to a dark red thread.
This is most intriguing. See how it runs through the center of both patterns, seeming to hold them together?
Everyone in the tent nodded. He turned directly to Denise.
That thread is you, my girl. Yes, it is. You are what they speak of in science class. You are what they write about in their poetry.
Suddenly, Denise broke into laughter and more tears.
Good gracious, now what is it?
Denise sheepishly dried her eyes.
I'm sorry. It's just, well, the thing is...
She tried to explain but couldn't. Everything was just too good, too perfect, and that meant laughter and tears. But it wasn't only Denise. It seemed like everyone in the tent had suddenly come down with a good case of smiles and sniffles. Everyone but Mr. Hornsberry. After all, stuffed dogs know better than to cry. They mildew.
But Denny's thread, it keeps showing up in both of their tapestries all the way to the end.
And in their children's, and in their children's children's, they will remember her life throughout their civilization, passing her exploits down from one generation to the next. In fact, until the end of time, they will claim she is the one responsible for the subtle rose hue that colors their ocean. They say this is to remind them of her love, as well as her promise to return someday.
He turned to Denise.
A promise that as their creator, you are bound to keep.
Denise nodded eagerly. There would be no problem keeping that promise. In fact, she wouldn't mind keeping it right now. But that was out of the question. For now, at least, they would have to return home.
That's all I've got to say. You better get a move on. Yes, you better. If I remember your patterns correctly, you'll be leaving here.
He glanced at his wristwatch.
In less than 48 seconds.
The tent exploded into action. Everyone began hugging, shouting thank yous, saying goodbyes, and making the usual promises to stay in touch. It was during this confusion that Josh pulled the Weaver aside.
Listen, I just want to thank you. I mean, I know I was a bit of a pain, not believing in everything.
Most of you are. But we're getting used to it.
Josh gave a smile and continued.
If you could also tell Bud thanks for me. I mean, I didn't get to say much when we rushed Denny out of there and everything, but he really did help me. A lot.
You'll get a chance to thank him yourself. Yes, you will.
What? When?
The Weaver lowered his voice and glanced about the room to make sure he wasn't overheard.
I shouldn't say anything, but he will be cross-dimensionalizing over to your dimension soon. Very soon.
The Weaver scowled slightly.
But with him will also come the illusionist, as well as your little brother's enemy, Bobak.
But we'll still be okay. I mean, everything will be all right.
The Weaver took a deep breath. For a moment it looked like he would answer, then suddenly he changed his mind.
I've said too much already.
Oh, come on.
Josh, go let's.
Lister Q had grouped all those heading back to the Upside-Down Kingdom at the far end of the tent. But Josh paid little attention. He was still searching the Weaver's face.
You've got to tell me something.
Just be careful. It is a most clever plan.
But we'll be all right, won't we?
Go let's. Come on, Josh.
The group started pulling him away, leading him toward Lister Q. With a few more tugs and jostles, they finally placed him alongside Denise, Nathan, Mr. Hornsberry, Aristophanes, and Lister Q. Josh scanned the crowd for the Weaver, but the man was nowhere to be found.
All righty! Let's move. Let's go. Let's have no more stops. It's straight from Fayrah to Grandpa's second-hand shop.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Denise caught Violet's and Samson's eyes. It was too noisy to be heard, so she could only mouth the words. "Thank you," she said. Both insects understood and flickered their red tail lights in response. Lister Q reached for his cross-dimensionalizer and prepared to punch in the coordinates. Suddenly the group was crossing through the center with all of its splendors and glories. And although there was much to see, they knew that it would have to wait for another time. Hopefully they would return again. And when they came, they knew they would not be disappointed. Unfortunately, they should have also known that Lister Q's aim had not improved. This time he only missed their landing coordinates by a few feet. But inside Grandpa O'Brien's cluttered second-hand shop, a few feet was as good as a mile.
Lister Q!
Cool, is it?
And so, with the appropriate groans and complaints, everyone climbed out of the front window's display of pots and pans. For some, it was quite a struggle.
It's stuck to my rear. Will someone pull this thing off my rear?
But no one complained too loudly. After all, practice makes perfect. And over the next several months, Lister Q would have many more opportunities to get his coordinates right for traveling into that shop. Many, many more.